Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're taking a quiet journey into one of the most difficult moments in the entire history of our planet, a time when Earth came closer than it ever has to losing almost everything alive on its surface and in its seas. Not from an asteroid, not from a single explosion in the sky, and not from one dramatic afternoon where the world suddenly realised it had left the oven on. This was slower, deeper, and in many ways more frightening. It was a planetary crisis that unfolded over thousands and thousands of years, so long by human standards that no single creature living through it could have understood the full size of what was happening. Forests failed, oceans changed, the air grew hostile in places, volcanoes poured out enough lava and gas to alter the whole climate system. The seas lost oxygen. The water became toxic. Life did not simply face a bad season. It faced a world that was gradually becoming harder and harder to survive, and yet somehow a thin thread of life held on. Before we begin wandering through that ancient disaster, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you somewhere warm, somewhere cold, somewhere already dark and quiet, or somewhere where morning has just begun? It is a strange thing, isn't it, to sit safely in the modern world and look back at a time when Earth itself almost stopped being a comfortable home for complex life. If you find this kind of slow journey soothing, or interesting, or just a calm way to let the day loosen its grip a little, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm science reach others who might also enjoy falling asleep to stories about volcanoes, ancient oceans, and the occasional mass extinction, which sounds less relaxing than it is, but we do our best. Now settle in gently. Let your thoughts slow down. There is no need to rush through a story that took the planet such a long time to live through. Tonight we're not beginning with the end of the dinosaurs, because that famous disaster, dramatic as it was not the closest life ever came to the edge. To find that moment, we need to travel much further back, long before humans, long before birds, long before flowers, long before the first mammals curled quietly in the undergrowth. We need to return to a world that would look familiar in some ways and completely alien in others. A world where nearly all the land was gathered into one enormous supercontinent, where reptiles and strange mammal-like animals moved across dry interiors, where forests grew under different skies, and where the oceans were full of life that had no idea how fragile its future had become. The event we're moving toward is often called the end Permian mass extinction, or more dramatically, the Great Dying. It happened around 252 million years ago, at the boundary between the Permian period and the Triassic period, and if the name sounds severe, that is because it earned it. Around 9 out of every 10 marine species disappeared. On land, the losses were also devastating. Insects, which usually seem almost impossible to discourage, suffered their only known mass extinction. Forests collapsed across large regions. Ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build were stripped apart. Reefs vanished. Food chains broke. The recovery was not quick. It took millions of years for life to rebuild the kind of complexity it had once had, which is quite a long time to wait for the neighbourhood to become lively again. If Earth had a diary, this would not be a page with a neat little note saying, "Had a difficult Tuesday." It would be a long, smudged, smoke-stained section, where the handwriting becomes harder to read. But what makes this ancient disaster especially unsettling is not just how many species died. Extinction, after all, is part of life's long history. Species appear, adapt, spread, and eventually vanish. That has always happened. What makes the Great Dying so remarkable is how many different parts of the Earth system seem to have gone wrong at once. It was not just heat, though there was a great deal of heat. It was not just volcanoes, though volcanoes were very much involved and were not being subtle about it. It was not just toxic oceans, or acid rain, or collapsing forests, or the breakdown of oxygen in seawater. It was the way these things appear to have connected, one problem feeding another, each change pushing the planet further from the conditions that complex life needed. Earth did not become lifeless, but it became deeply unfriendly. And there is a difference between a world that kills everything and a world that makes survival exhausting. The Permian world seems to have been the second kind, a place where life was not instantly erased, but squeezed from many sides at once. To understand why this matters, it helps to think of Earth not as a fixed stage, but as a living system of connected parts. The air, the oceans, rocks, volcanoes, climate, microbes, forests, animals, and chemistry are all linked in ways that can be stable for very long stretches of time. Most of the time, the planet is not perfectly calm, of course. It has ice ages, warming periods, shifting continents, rising seas, falling seas, and the occasional asteroid with extremely poor timing. But life usually adapts because change often comes in a rhythm slow enough for ecosystems to adjust. Not always, but often. The Great Dying seems to have been different because the changes were too much, too widespread, and too persistent. It was like taking a well-balanced household and then turning off the heating, flooding the kitchen, filling the living room with smoke, hiding all the food, and asking everyone to remain cheerful. Some organisms managed, most did not. The main suspect behind much of this trouble was a vast volcanic province known as the Siberian Traps. Today, the remains of those eruptions are found across a huge region of what is now Siberia. But in the late Permian, this was not just a volcano in the familiar mountain and crater sense. It was an enormous outpouring of lava across the landscape, a series of eruptions so large that they are difficult to picture without the mind quietly giving up and asking for a biscuit. Lava spread across areas that could cover modern countries. Magma pushed through the crust. Gases escaped into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, methane and other substances may have been released in enormous amounts, both from the eruptions themselves and from rocks and sediments heated by the magma underground. This matters because volcanoes do more than produce lava. They can change climate. They can alter ocean chemistry. They can darken skies for shorter periods and warm the planet over longer ones. A small eruption can disrupt a region. A truly gigantic volcanic episode can lean on the entire Earth system. At first, volcanic pollution can cool the climate for a little while if sulfur aerosols reflect sunlight back into space. But over longer timescales, carbon dioxide can trap heat. If enough is added quickly enough, the world warms. During the Permian crisis, there is strong evidence that global temperatures rose sharply. The tropics may have become dangerously hot for many animals. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water, which is already a problem if you happen to be a fish, a shellfish, or anything else trying to breathe underwater without making a fuss about it. At the same time, warmer oceans can become more stratified, meaning the layers mix less easily. When surface and deep waters stop mixing well, oxygen from the surface has a harder time reaching the depths. Then deep waters can become anoxic, meaning depleted of oxygen. In some places, they may even become euxinic, which is an unpleasant word for an unpleasant condition. Water lacking oxygen and containing hydrogen sulfide, a toxic compound produced by certain microbes. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs, which is already rude enough, but at high enough levels it is deadly. For marine life, this was not simply a change in scenery. It was like having the ocean slowly forget how to breathe. That image, the ocean forgetting how to breathe, sits near the centre of this story. Life in the sea depends on invisible things: oxygen dissolved in water, a stable balance of acidity, nutrients cycling in the right amounts, currents carrying chemistry around the globe. When those systems falter, even creatures protected by shells, reefs, burrows, or ancient evolutionary stubbornness can find themselves in trouble. The late Permian oceans were full of life before the collapse. Brachiopods, ammonoids, corals, sponges, crinoids, trilobites, bivalves, fish, and many kinds of small organisms that rarely get the dramatic attention they deserve. The seafloor was not empty. Reefs created habitats. Shell-forming creatures built hard parts from seawater chemistry. Food webs linked tiny plankton to larger animals. But if the water warms, loses oxygen, becomes more acidic, and in places turns toxic, then the basic rules of survival change. Shells become hard to maintain. Breathing becomes difficult. Reproduction fails. Habitats disappear. And because ecosystems are networks, the loss of one group can pull down another. If your food disappears, your own excellent personality may not save you. On land, the crisis was different but no less severe. The late Permian world was dominated by the supercontinent Pangaea, a huge landmass stretching from pole to pole. The interior of such a giant continent would have been dry in many regions, far from the moderating influence of the sea. Seasonal extremes could be intense. Before the extinction, land ecosystems included forests of seed plants, conifers, ginkgophytes, and other groups, along with amphibians, reptiles, and synapsids, the mammal relatives that were among the most important land animals of the time. Some synapsids looked a bit like reptiles to modern eyes, though they were on the evolutionary line that would eventually lead to mammals. There were large herbivores, predators, burrowers, and smaller creatures going about their ancient business with no awareness that they were living near the end of an era. Then the climate shifted. Heat increased. Rainfall patterns changed. Wildfires may have become more common in some regions. Vegetation suffered. Soils eroded. Rivers carried more sediment into the seas. The land did not simply lose animals, it lost stability. One of the quieter but very important signs of ecological collapse comes from plants and soils. When forests are healthy, they hold landscapes together. Roots stabilise sediment. Leaves feed soils. Plant communities help regulate local moisture and provide homes and food for animals. When vegetation collapses, erosion can increase dramatically. Rivers become muddier. Nutrients wash into the oceans where they can feed microbial blooms that further reduce oxygen in the water. So a land crisis can become an ocean crisis, and an ocean crisis can reflect back into the atmosphere. Earth is very good at connecting things, which is usually lovely if we're talking about rain watering a forest, and less lovely if we're talking about a continental-scale ecological breakdown helping to suffocate the seas. It can be tempting to imagine mass extinction as a single line drawn across time. Before it, life. After it, ruin. But the real process was likely more complicated. There may have been pulses of extinction. Some environments may have failed earlier than others. Some species may have survived the first wave only to disappear later, as conditions worsened or failed to improve. Recovery would have been uneven too. A shoreline here, a refuge there, a hardy population tucked into a tolerable pocket while the wider world struggled. Life rarely responds to disaster like a row of lights switching off all at once. It flickers. Some lights go dark, others dim. A few keep burning in sheltered places, and from those small points the future slowly grows. This is one reason the Great Dying is not only a story of destruction, it is also a story about endurance, though not the triumphant quick kind that fits neatly into a motivational poster. The organisms that survived did so in a damaged world. They endured heat, scarcity, unstable habitats, low oxygen, and disrupted food chains. Some were small, some were generalists, able to eat varied foods or tolerate harsh conditions. Some may have lived in burrows or moved through environments that protected them from the worst extremes. In the oceans, certain groups survived where others vanished almost completely. These survivors were not necessarily the strongest in a dramatic sense. They were the ones whose biology, location, timing, and luck happened to match the narrow openings that remained. Evolution often works with whatever is still standing after the storm, even if what is still standing looks slightly bewildered and covered in ash. What makes this ancient event especially relevant is that it shows how life's security depends on planetary conditions staying within certain boundaries. Earth is not fragile in the sense that a teacup is fragile. The planet itself has survived giant impacts, magma oceans, ice ages, shifting continents, and billions of years of change. Rocks can take a great deal of abuse. Life as a whole is also incredibly resilient, especially microbial life. Bacteria and archaea have survived conditions that would make most animals write a formal letter of complaint. But complex ecosystems are more delicate. Forests, reefs, large animals, food webs, and stable habitats can be deeply vulnerable when climate, chemistry, and oxygen change too quickly or too severely. The Great Dying reminds us that Earth can remain a planet while becoming a much harder place to live. It does not need to crack in half to become dangerous. Sometimes it only has to warm, acidify, stagnate, and lose balance. And yet we should be careful not to turn the story into a simple warning label. The end Permian extinction was not the same as the modern world. The continents were arranged differently. The volcanic activity was extraordinary. The atmosphere, oceans, and ecosystems were not identical to ours. The creatures living then were not modern creatures. This was a deep time event with deep time causes. But studying it gives scientists a way to understand how Earth systems behave under stress. It shows what can happen when huge amounts of carbon enter the atmosphere, when oceans lose oxygen, when warming becomes severe, and when ecosystems are pushed beyond their ability to adjust. It is not a perfect mirror. Ancient Earth never is. It is more like a fossilized case study written in stone, chemistry, and absence. The strange thing about absence is that it can be one of the strongest pieces of evidence. In rocks from before the extinction, fossils may be diverse and abundant. Then, across the boundary, many disappear. Whole groups become rare or vanish. Reef structures decline. Burrows in the sediment change, suggesting that animals that once churned and mixed the seafloor were gone or greatly reduced. In some places, the rock record becomes quieter, as if the busy background noise of life had been turned down. Scientists read these changes not from one perfect location, but from many sites around the world, comparing fossils, chemical signatures, volcanic layers, carbon isotopes, and sediment patterns. It is slow detective work. No one finds a stone tablet saying, "The ocean became unpleasant this week." Instead, the evidence accumulates grain by grain, shell by shell, isotope by isotope, until a picture begins to form. That picture is still being refined. Scientists continue to debate details, exactly how fast the extinction unfolded, which kill mechanisms mattered most, how volcanic gases were released, how land and ocean crises interacted, and why some organisms survived when others did not. This is normal science, not confusion in the casual sense. Earth's history is not a tidy filing cabinet. It is a very old, very large archive where half the pages have been folded, buried, heated, dissolved, or eaten by geological time, and still, enough remains for us to recognise the scale of what happened. The end Permian crisis was the greatest known mass extinction in Earth's history. It nearly ended the long experiment of complex life. It cleared ecosystems so thoroughly that the world after it was not just a continuation, but a rebuilding. For a sleep science journey, this might sound rather intense. A planet overheating, oceans losing oxygen, extinction on a scale almost beyond imagination. Not exactly the usual ingredients for a peaceful evening, and yet there is a quietness in deep time that can make even the most severe stories feel spacious. None of this happened in a single human lifetime. The rocks do not shout, the fossils do not hurry, they simply wait for us to notice them, and as we look back, we're reminded that our planet has had many versions of itself. There was an Earth before grass, an Earth before birdsong, an Earth before flowers, before whales, before forests as we know them, before humans gave names to months and mountains and weather forecasts. The Earth of the late Permian was one of those older worlds, and it came very close to losing the complexity it had spent so long building. So tonight, as we begin this journey, we start not at the moment of death itself, but with the question that makes the story worth following. How does a living planet become almost unlivable? Not instantly, not magically, but through linked physical changes that build into catastrophe. How does lava in Siberia help suffocate distant seas? How does carbon in the air become stress in the body of an animal? How does heat ripple into forests, rivers, microbes, reefs, and bones? These are the threads we will follow, and to follow them properly, we need to first step into the world before the collapse, when the continents were joined, the climate was shifting, and life, unaware of what was coming, filled the land and sea with forms both familiar and strange. To understand how close Earth came to losing the living world it had built, we first need to spend a little time in the world before the collapse, because disasters are always easier to understand when we know what was there to be lost. The late Permian Earth was not empty, not primitive in the way people sometimes imagine deep time to be, and certainly not just a dull waiting room for the dinosaurs to arrive. It was a busy planet, full of strange animals, broad forests, shallow seas, insects, predators, burrowers, reefs, rivers, and landscapes that had their own ancient routines. If you could stand there safely with a very good breathing system, an excellent sun hat, and perhaps a polite agreement with the local predators, you would recognize parts of it. There would be wind, there would be clouds, there would be shorelines, storms, mud, heat, hunger, growth, and all the ordinary negotiations that life makes with its surroundings. But it would not feel like our Earth. It was an older version of the planet, one with different continents, different air, different plants, different animals, and a very different sense of what counted as normal. The first thing you would notice, if you could look down from orbit, is that the continents were not scattered around the globe as they are today. There was no Atlantic Ocean separating the Americas from Africa and Europe. There was no familiar map with its broken puzzle pieces spread widely apart. Instead, nearly all the major land masses had gathered into one enormous supercontinent called Pangaea. The name means all Earth, and for once, science chose a name that is fairly direct and not too fussy. Pangaea stretched across the planet like a vast uneven shield of land, reaching from high northern latitudes down toward the south, with coastlines running along immense distances and a huge interior lying far from the sea. Around it lay Panthalassa, a global ocean so large that calling it an ocean almost feels modest. And along the eastern side of Pangaea, near the equator, was the Tethys Ocean, a warm body of water that would become very important in later Earth history. Pangaea formed during the Permian as major landmasses fused together, and this arrangement strongly shaped the climate and habitats of the time. A supercontinent changes the world in ways that can be hard to picture at first. Today, much of Earth's land is close enough to oceans to feel their influence. Oceans store heat, release moisture, soften seasonal extremes, and generally behave like the planet's large, slow-moving thermostat, though not always one with especially clear instructions. But in the interior of Pangaea, enormous areas of land sat far from the moderating reach of the sea. This meant large seasonal swings. Summers could be intensely hot. Winters could be cold in some regions. Rainfall could be unpredictable, and large dry zones likely spread across inland basins. The edges of the supercontinent, especially near tropical seas, could be humid and biologically rich, but the inland world could be harsh, dusty, and difficult. If modern continents have moods, Pangaea had several at once, and some of them were not particularly welcoming. This does not mean the Permian world was lifeless or bleak. Far from it. Life had already been evolving for billions of years, and complex ecosystems had taken hold across land and sea. The great explosion of animal life in the oceans had happened long before. Plants had moved onto land long before. Forests had already changed the air, the soil, and the flow of water across continents. Insects had been flying for tens of millions of years. Vertebrates had left the water and spread into terrestrial habitats. By the late Permian, life on land was no longer an experimental visitor nervously testing the shoreline. It had become established, diverse, and in some places impressively confident. But the plants of this world were not the flowering plants that dominate so many modern landscapes. There were no grasses spreading across open plains as we know them today. No apple trees, no daisies, no roses, no wheat fields, no bees drifting between bright petals. Flowering plants would not rise to dominance until much later. The Permian plant world was built from other groups: conifers, seed ferns, ginkgophytes, cycads and cycad-like plants, horsetails and other lineages that would look familiar only in pieces. Some forests may have seemed somewhat modern at a glance, with tall trunks and shaded understories, but the details would quickly give away the age of the scene. Leaves, bark, cones, spores, and branching patterns would all belong to a world before flowers took over the land and began decorating everything with suspicious enthusiasm. In wetter regions, forests could be dense and active, storing carbon, holding soil in place, and creating habitats for animals. In drier regions, vegetation would have been more open, tougher, and better adapted to water stress. The late Permian was already a time of climate variation, and plants had to deal with shifting rainfall, seasonal dryness, and the geography of a supercontinent. Where plants grew well, they shaped everything around them. Their roots gripped sediment. Their fallen leaves fed soils. Their trunks and branches created shelter. Their presence slowed erosion and helped regulate local environments. It is easy to think of plants as background scenery, because they do not usually roar, chase, or make dramatic entrances. But in a living world, plants are infrastructure. Remove them, and landscapes begin to fall apart in a very literal way. The animals moving through these landscapes were just as different from today's as the plants. The late Permian was a time before dinosaurs became dominant. Dinosaurs did not yet rule the land. Birds did not sing from branches. Mammals did not scurry through the night in the forms we would recognize. Instead, many of the major land animals were synapsids, the broad evolutionary group that includes mammals and their extinct relatives. Some Permian synapsids are often described as mammal-like reptiles, though that phrase is a bit outdated and not quite fair to anyone involved. They were not mammals, and they were not simply reptiles wearing a slightly mammalian expression. They were their own successful, varied lineages, experimenting with body shapes, teeth, posture, feeding styles, and ways of living that would eventually, much later, lead toward true mammals. Some synapsids were large herbivores, barrel-bodied and sturdy, feeding on tough vegetation with the patient determination of animals that no salads were not invented for convenience. Others were predators with strong skulls and sharp teeth. The famous Dimetrodon, with its tall sail along the back, actually lived earlier in the Permian and was not a dinosaur, despite being placed in far too many dinosaur toy sets over the years. By the late Permian, more advanced synapsids called therapsids had become important. Among them were herbivorous dicynodonts, often beaked, tusked and squat, and carnivorous gorgonopsians, some of the top predators of their time, equipped with saber-like canine teeth and a face that suggests they were not especially interested in friendly conversation. The Permian saw major diversification among synapsids and reptiles, with therapsids becoming especially important later in the period. There were also reptiles, amphibians, and many smaller creatures living in and around rivers, floodplains, forests, and dry uplands. Amphibians still mattered, especially in wetter habitats, though many depended on water for reproduction and would have been vulnerable to drying environments. Reptiles, with their amniotic eggs, were better suited to life away from water and had been diversifying through the Permian. Insects were also abundant and varied. Some were large, some were small, some fed on plants, some on other insects, and some probably spent their days doing whatever the Permian equivalent of being mildly annoying was. Insects had already become a major part of terrestrial ecosystems, pollinating some plants in limited ways, decomposing organic matter, serving as food, and carving out countless small ecological roles. Their later losses during the Great Dying are especially striking because insects are normally quite good at surviving, hiding, multiplying, and generally making themselves difficult to remove from the planet. If we wandered toward the coast, the late Permian world would become richer in another way. Shallow seas around parts of Pangaea supported marine communities filled with animals that had long histories of their own. Brachiopods, which look superficially like clams but belong to a different group, were common and diverse. Bivalves were present too, though they had not yet taken over many seafloor roles in the way they would later. Ammonoids, coiled relatives of squid and octopuses, moved through the water. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, anchored themselves and filtered food from the currents. Sponges, corals, bryozoans, and many other organisms built structures, filtered water, crawled, burrowed, fed, reproduced, and died in sediments that would one day become evidence. Trilobites, once so dominant in earlier Paleozoic seas, were still around but reduced, living near the end of their long story. They had survived hundreds of millions of years and several earlier crises, which is a respectable record by any measure, but even their long career was approaching its final page. Reefs existed, but they were not the same as modern coral reefs. The organisms that built reef systems changed across geologic time, and late Permian reef communities included sponges, algae, bryozoans, and other carbonate-producing organisms. These reefs created habitats for many species, making three-dimensional structures on the seafloor where animals could hide, feed, and attach themselves. A reef is more than stone made by life. It is an apartment block, a marketplace, a nursery, and a very slow construction project all at once. When reef systems collapse, the loss is not just the builders, it is the entire community that depends on the structure. That would matter greatly later when the oceans began to change. The seas themselves were shaped by the geography of Pangaea. With one giant landmass and one vast surrounding ocean, circulation patterns were different from those of today. Ocean currents depend on the positions of continents, the shape of basins, temperature gradients, winds, salinity, and the movement of water between shallow and deep regions. Change the map, and you change the movement of the sea. In the Permian, broad, shallow marine shelves existed in some regions, but the assembly of Pangaea had also reduced some coastal habitats compared with earlier periods. The inland climate could feed sediments and nutrients into rivers, and those rivers carried materials into seas. The whole system was connected, as Earth systems always are, whether convenient or not. The atmosphere was also different. Oxygen levels had been very high during parts of the earlier Carboniferous period, which helped support giant insect and vast coal-forming swamp forests. By the Permian, oxygen levels had changed, and carbon dioxide levels varied across the period. The planet was moving away from some of the conditions that had defined the earlier Paleozoic. Ice sheets that had existed in the southern hemisphere earlier in the Permian retreated as climates warmed. The world was already changing before the final crisis arrived. That is important, because mass extinctions rarely strike perfectly stable worlds. They often happen when long-term pressures and sudden triggers overlap, when systems already under stress receive one more shove, and then another, and then perhaps a volcanic shove wearing heavy boots. In this older Earth, seasons would have mattered deeply. Across Pangaea, monsoon-like circulation may have affected large areas, with seasonal winds and rainfall shifting as land heated and cooled. Imagine the huge interior baking under the sun, drawing winds inward, then cooling, reversing patterns, moving moisture unevenly across the land. Some regions may have experienced intense wet seasons followed by long dry periods. Rivers may have swollen and shrunk, lakes may have expanded and evaporated, animals would have followed water and food, plants would have timed growth and reproduction to patterns that were reliable enough for survival, until they were not. Daily life in such a world, if we can call it that, was built around ordinary pressures. A desynodont searching for vegetation would not have been thinking about continental configurations. A predator tracking prey would not have cared that future scientists would place it near the end of the Paleozoic era. An insect laying eggs in plant tissue was not concerned with isotope ratios. Life was local. It always is, when you're living it. The creature in the mud cares about the mud. The animal in the shade cares about the shade. The fish in the water cares about oxygen, temperature, food, and not being eaten in a way that seems personally inconvenient. The great planetary systems were already moving in the background, but life experienced them as weather, hunger, drought, breeding seasons, migration, disease, and chance. That is one of the sobering things about mass extinction. It is planetary when seen from a distance, but intimate when seen up close. It happens to bodies. It happens to eggs that do not hatch, young that do not survive, reefs that do not regrow, burrows left empty, forests that fail to return after fire or drought. It happens as 1,000 local failures repeated across a world. The late Permian biosphere was not waiting dramatically beneath a dark sky. It was simply living, and because it was living, it was vulnerable. Even before the final extinction, the Permian had seen ecological transitions and earlier disturbances. Scientists have discussed earlier extinction pulses and faunal changes during the period, including shifts among land vertebrates and marine groups. This matters because the Permian catastrophe did not arrive in a world that had never known stress. Life had already adapted through changes in climate, sea level, and continental arrangement. Some groups had declined, others had risen. The late Permian world was the result of long evolutionary sorting, with ecosystems that seemed stable from the point of view of the animals inside them, but were still part of a restless planet. On land, therapsids were among the great success stories. Dicynodonts, for example, were widespread herbivores, and some were extremely abundant. They had beaks, and some had tusks, giving them a somewhat odd but memorable appearance, like a pig, a turtle, and a grumpy garden tool had held a committee meeting. They ranged in size from small to large and occupied many herbivorous roles. Predatory therapsids, including gorgonopsians and therocephalians, filled carnivore niches. Some had powerful bites and specialized teeth. These were not clumsy evolutionary rough drafts. They were well-adapted animals in functioning ecosystems. The fact that many would disappear does not mean they were failures. It means the rules changed too quickly and too severely. In freshwater habitats, life gathered around rivers, lakes, floodplains, and wetlands. Amphibians, fish, invertebrates, and plants depended on these systems. Waterways would have acted as corridors through dry landscapes, supporting pockets of diversity where surrounding land was harsher. During stable times, such habitats can serve as refuges. During severe climate disruption, they can also become traps, shrinking under drought, overheating, or changing chemistry. A river is a lifeline only as long as it keeps flowing in the right way. The skies would have been quieter in some ways. No birds crossed them, no bats flitted at dusk. Flying insects were present, but the aerial world lacked many familiar modern forms. The sounds would have been different too. No human voices, of course. No frogs quite like ours, no songbirds, no buzzing modern grasslands. Wind through conifers and seed ferns. Water moving over sediment. Insects. The calls or movements of animals we can only partly imagine. Deep time is often silent to us because fossils preserve bones and shells more readily than sound, smell, behaviour, or the small daily noises that make a place feel alive. But the world itself would not have been silent. Life is rarely quiet when it is busy surviving. The smell of the late Permian world would have varied from place to place, and perhaps that is a detail worth lingering on, because smell makes an ancient landscape feel less like a diagram. Coastal flats may have smelled of salt, mud, algae, and decay. Forested areas may have carried resinous scents from conifers, damp soil after rain, and the sharp smell of plant material drying in heat. Dry interiors may have smelled of dust, mineral earth, and sparse vegetation. Near volcanic regions, long before the largest eruptions fully unfolded, there may have been sulphurous gases and hot springs in some places. Earth was not yet in its worst state, but it was never a perfectly tidy planet. It has always had vents, swamps, fires, storms, and things rotting quietly where no one asked them to. Because Pangaea was so large, the difference between coastal and inland life could be extreme. Along some margins, moisture from the sea supported more productive environments. Inland, the world could become more seasonal and arid. Animals living there would need strategies for heat and dryness, burrowing, moving between habitats, timing reproduction, tolerating scarcity, or feeding on tough plants. Burrowing may have been especially useful for some animals, offering protection from temperature extremes, dehydration, and predators. Later, during and after the extinction, burrowing lifestyles may have helped certain survivors endure hostile conditions. A burrow is not glamorous, but glamour is rarely the deciding factor during planetary crisis. The oceans, meanwhile, held many of the groups that would suffer most severely. Marine animals are often sensitive to changes in oxygen, temperature, acidity, and carbonate chemistry. Shell-building organisms depend on the availability of carbonate ions in seawater. Reef builders depend on clear, suitable, oxygenated waters and stable ecological interactions. Animals living on or in the seafloor depend on oxygen reaching sediments. If deep waters become stagnant, if oxygen minimum zones expand, if toxic chemistry rises, entire habitats can disappear. Before the collapse, many marine ecosystems were diverse and active. This is why the later fossil record is so stark. The loss is visible because there had been so much there. There is a habit when imagining ancient worlds to treat them as steps on the way to us. The Permian becomes the thing before the Triassic, which becomes the thing before the Jurassic, which becomes the thing with the dinosaurs, which eventually leads to mammals, then humans, then someone eating cereal, while watching a documentary about extinction at midnight. But the Permian was not a waiting room, it was a complete world in its own right. Its animals were not practicing for later animals, its forests were not placeholders for future forests, its seas were not preliminary sketches. Life at the time had no goal of becoming modern, it was already fully engaged in being itself. That makes the coming collapse more meaningful. The Great Dying did not clear away an unfinished draft. It destroyed mature ecosystems with long histories. It ended lineages that had survived previous upheavals. It reduced rich marine communities to a far simpler state. It reshaped terrestrial life so profoundly that the world after the extinction would belong increasingly to different survivors, and, eventually, to new evolutionary experiments. The rise of dinosaurs in the Triassic and Jurassic, far later and through many additional turns, was made possible in part by the clearing of ecological space after the end Permian disaster. But for the creatures living before it, that future was irrelevant. They were not stepping aside for dinosaurs. They were meeting a crisis they could not understand. The signs of approaching danger were not visible in the way a storm cloud is visible. There was no single horizon where every animal could look up and think, well, this seems ominous. Instead, the conditions that would drive the catastrophe were building through geological processes. Beneath what is now Siberia, magma was involved in one of the largest volcanic episodes in Earth history. The crust was being invaded and broken by molten rock. Sedimentary layers rich in carbon, evaporates, coal, and organic matter may have been heated, releasing gases that would amplify the effects of the eruptions. The atmosphere and oceans were about to be forced into a new state. But on the surface, for a time, life continued. A forest does not know that magma is rising far away. A reef does not know that carbon is being prepared underground. A predator does not know that the climate system has thresholds. This is not because life is foolish, it is because life is immediate. It responds to what it can sense: warmth, water, food, danger, mates, shelter, seasons. The deeper machinery of the planet works at scales too large for any creature to notice directly. By the time those changes arrive as heat, drought, acidifying water, low oxygen, or failing food chains, They are no longer abstract processes, they are survival problems. So the ancient world before the collapse was not peaceful in the sense of being safe forever. No living world is. It was peaceful only in the ordinary sense that ecosystems can seem stable, while forces gather beyond their edges. Pangaea lay under its varied climates. Panthalassa moved around it. The Tethys warmed along the margins. Synapsids fed, hunted, burrowed, and bred. Insects moved through vegetation. Marine animals filtered seawater, built shells and occupied reefs. Rivers carried sediment. Plants held soil. Microbes worked invisibly everywhere, as microbes always do, running much of the planet while receiving very little applause. And underneath one part of that world, deep below the surface, the conditions for disaster were assembling slowly, with no need for drama, no hurry by human standards, and no awareness among the living that the ground itself was preparing to change the air. Far beneath that ancient world, below the forests, floodplains, inland deserts, shallow seas, and slow-moving animals of the late Permian, the Earth was preparing one of the largest volcanic events in its history. It didn't begin as a single mountain exploding in a dramatic cone of fire, the way we might picture a volcano from a film or a school diagram. There was no neat peak with smoke curling from the top, no one obvious crater acting as the villain of the story, no fiery summit waiting for the right musical cue. This was something much larger and stranger. It was a vast region of the planet where molten rock rose from deep below, pushed into the crust, spread through underground layers, burst onto the surface, and kept doing so again and again until enormous parts of the landscape were buried under lava. Today we call this volcanic province the Siberian Traps, and the word traps does not mean a sneaky geological device, though in a way it did trap life in a very difficult situation. It comes from a word for steps, because flood basalts often weather into stair-like layers. Layer upon layer of ancient lava stacked across the land like the planet had been building a staircase no creature had asked for and no one could climb safely. The Siberian Traps erupted in what is now northern Asia, across a region that still holds the frozen remains of that ancient violence in its rocks. But in the late Permian, the geography, climate and ecosystems were different, and the eruptions were not simply a local disaster. The scale was so huge that the atmosphere and oceans became part of the event. That is one of the most important things to understand about very large volcanic provinces. A normal volcanic eruption can devastate nearby land, bury forests, poison streams, and send ash into the air. It can frighten anyone with a sensible respect for molten rock, which should be all of us. But a flood basalt event of this size does something broader. It reaches beyond the place where lava flows. It releases gases. It heats buried sediments. It changes the chemistry of the air. It can warm the planet, disturb rainfall, acidify the oceans, and help create conditions in which entire ecosystems begin to fail. The lava is dramatic, but the invisible gases may have been even more important. Imagine the first phases of eruption not as one continuous wall of lava moving across the whole world, but as repeated pulses. Cracks opened, magma rose. In some places it poured out across the surface in sheets, not like the steep tumbling lava of a familiar volcano, but in broad flows that could spread over wide areas. These flows may have advanced across lowlands, filling valleys, covering river systems, burying soils, and hardening into dark basalt. One flow would cool, and then another would come, then another. Over time, the landscape became a layered volcanic plain, with black rock where older ground had been. If you were standing anywhere nearby, which would be a very poor life choice unless you were a rock, the air might have carried heat, ash, sulphurous fumes, and the deep vibration of a planet opening itself. It would not have felt like a single eruption. It would have felt like the world had developed a long, severe fever. The eruptions likely lasted in pulses over hundreds of thousands of years, perhaps longer depending on how the different stages are counted. That timescale can feel almost too large to hold in mind. To a human, 1,000 years is history. 10,000 years is prehistory. 100,000 years is a span so large it becomes difficult to imagine without turning it into a number and quietly moving on. But for Earth systems, these timescales can be fast, especially when huge amounts of carbon and other gases enter the atmosphere. The planet has ways of buffering change, but those buffers have limits. Rocks weather, oceans absorb carbon dioxide, sediments store chemicals, life itself participates in cycles of carbon, oxygen, sulfur, nitrogen, and many others. But if disturbance comes too strongly or too quickly, those systems cannot keep conditions steady. It is a little like a household trying to stay tidy while someone keeps throwing muddy boots into the hallway. For a while, you can manage. Eventually, the hallway becomes a geological problem. The gases released by the Siberian traps were central to the disaster. Carbon dioxide was one of the most important. As volcanic carbon dioxide built up in the atmosphere, it strengthened the greenhouse effect, trapping more heat and raising global temperatures. Carbon dioxide itself is not a poison at ordinary atmospheric levels. Plants use it. It is part of life's chemistry. But like many things, the problem is amount and speed. Add too much too quickly, and the climate system responds. The late Permian world warmed severely. Heat spread through the oceans and across the land. The tropics may have become dangerous for many animals, especially large ones with limited ability to shed heat. Plants faced heat stress and altered rainfall. Water bodies warmed. Dry regions became harsher. And because warm water holds less oxygen, every degree of warming made the seas more difficult for many animals to breathe in. It was not just that the planet became hotter, it became less physically generous. Sulfur gases also mattered, especially in the shorter term. Sulfur dioxide released into the atmosphere can form aerosols that reflect sunlight and produce temporary cooling. It can also contribute to acid rain, damaging plants, soils, freshwater systems and shallow marine environments. So the volcanic world may not have warmed in a smooth, simple way. There may have been intervals of cooling, haze, acid rain, and atmospheric instability mixed into the longer trend of severe greenhouse warming. This matters because living things do not respond only to averages. They respond to seasons, extremes, bad years, failed breeding cycles, droughts, floods, and sudden stresses. An animal does not say, "The long-term mean is concerning." It says, in whatever silent biological way it can, "There is no food here," or "the water is too warm," or "my eggs did not survive." Climate change becomes extinction through thousands of practical failures. There is another part of the story that makes the Siberian traps especially damaging. The magma did not only erupt at the surface, much of it pushed sideways and upward through the crust as underground intrusions called sills and dikes. These sheets and walls of hot magma forced their way into surrounding rocks. Some of those rocks contained large amounts of organic carbon, coal, evaporates, and other materials that could release gases when heated. In other words, the volcanoes were not only releasing their own carbon from deep inside Earth, they may also have baked the crust and cooked additional gases out of buried sediments. It is not the most appetizing image, but it may be one of the key mechanisms that turned a huge volcanic event into a planetary crisis. The magma became an underground furnace, heating rocks that had been quietly storing carbon and sulfur for ages, and sending more climate-altering gases into the air. Methane may have played a role as well. Methane is a powerful greenhouse gas, much stronger than carbon dioxide over shorter timescales, though it does not remain in the atmosphere as long. It could have been released from heated organic-rich sediments, from coal deposits, or through destabilized methane reservoirs in marine sediments as oceans warmed. Scientists still debate exactly how much methane was involved and from which sources, but even the possibility shows how the disaster could have amplified itself. Warming can release gases that cause more warming. More warming can stress oceans and ecosystems further. Feedbacks are not always dramatic in the beginning. Sometimes they are more like a quiet door being left open during winter. At first, you just notice a draft. Later, everyone is wearing a coat indoors and pretending this is fine. The sky during this volcanic age may have changed in ways no animal could interpret, but every animal would have felt. Near eruption sites, ash and gases would have darkened the air. Farther away, aerosols and dust could have produced hazy skies, strange sunsets, and changes in sunlight reaching the ground. Acid rain may have fallen in some regions, carrying sulfuric and other acids into soils, lakes, and rivers. Plants are especially exposed to atmospheric change. They cannot walk away when the rain turns harmful or the dry season grows longer. Leaves can be damaged. Growth can slow. Reproduction can fail. Roots can suffer as soils change chemically. When forests are stressed or killed, animals lose food and shelter, soils lose stability, and rivers begin carrying more sediment into the sea. A volcanic atmosphere can therefore become a forest problem, then a river problem, then an ocean problem, because Earth is very committed to group projects. The phrase volcanoes that covered the sky is useful not because the entire planet was literally under one permanent ash cloud, but because the eruptions filled the atmosphere with consequences. The sky became part of the eruption. It carried gases away from Siberia and spread their effects through climate and chemistry. It helped turn a regional geological event into a global biological emergency. This is a strange and important idea. Lava might cover land, but gases can cover the world. A creature thousands of kilometers away from the eruptions might never see a lava flow, never hear the cracking of basalt, never smell the strongest sulfur fumes, and yet still live and die because of what those volcanoes did. The connection would have been invisible, but no less real. The atmosphere is the planet's shared room. If one corner fills with smoke for long enough, everyone eventually notices. On land, warming and acid rain would have placed pressure on plants already living in a world with strong seasonal contrasts. Forests in some regions may have died back, others may have shifted in composition. Repeated environmental stress could have prevented recovery after droughts, fires, or storms. When plant cover thins, soils become vulnerable. Rainfall, when it comes, can strip loose sediment from hillsides and floodplains. Rivers turn muddy and unstable. The loss of rooted vegetation can transform landscapes from living surfaces into eroding ones. This does not require every tree to vanish everywhere at once. It only requires enough damage across enough regions to break the normal cycles of growth, soil formation, and habitat stability. Once that happens, animals that depend on plants begin to suffer, and predators that depend on those animals soon receive the news in the form of hunger. Wildfires may also have become more common, or more severe in some places. Heat, drought, and stressed vegetation create conditions in which fire spreads more easily. Charcoal in the rock record suggests fire was part of some late Permian landscapes. Fire itself is not always bad. Many modern ecosystems are adapted to it. But fire under severe climate stress is different. If plants are already struggling, repeated burning can prevent forests from returning. If soils are exposed afterward, erosion increases. If ash and sediment wash into rivers and seas, water chemistry changes. The land becomes less able to hold itself together. And again, this is not one problem. It is several problems agreeing to meet for tea and then setting the house on fire. Animals would have experienced the volcanic crisis through their bodies. Heat stress affects metabolism, movement, reproduction, and survival. Large animals often struggle more with extreme heat because they generate and retain more body heat. Water scarcity affects everything. Herbivores face declining food quality or quantity if plants suffer. Carnivores follow the decline of prey. Burrowing animals may have found temporary refuge underground, where temperatures are more stable and moisture can last longer. Small generalists may have had advantages over specialized animals tied to particular habitats or food sources, but even good adaptations have limits. A burrow helps only if there is food nearby. A flexible diet helps only if something edible remains. Tolerance is not immunity. In the oceans, the volcanic gases began setting up even more dangerous changes. As carbon dioxide increased in the atmosphere, more dissolved into seawater, forming carbonic acid and lowering pH. Ocean acidification can make it harder for shell-building organisms to maintain skeletons and shells made of calcium carbonate. Different groups vary in sensitivity, and ancient seawater chemistry was not identical to today's, but the basic challenge is clear. If the chemistry of seawater shifts against the materials your body uses, life becomes more expensive. You must spend more energy maintaining yourself. Reproduction may suffer, young stages may fail, reefs may stop growing or dissolve. That is a very quiet kind of violence, chemistry making existence harder, one ion at a time. At the same time, warming reduced oxygen availability in seawater. Warm water holds less oxygen, and warmer climates can weaken the mixing that normally carries oxygen from the surface into deeper layers. If the oceans become more layered, with warm water sitting above deeper water and less circulation between them, the deep ocean can become oxygen poor. Organic matter sinking from the surface is decomposed by microbes, which use up oxygen. If that oxygen is not replaced, anoxic conditions spread. In such conditions, many animals cannot survive. Some microbes can, and certain microbes produce hydrogen sulfide in oxygen-free environments. If euxinic waters expanded, parts of the ocean would not merely have lacked oxygen, they would have become toxic. For marine animals already stressed by heat and acidity, this was another tightening of the noose. The eruptions may also have affected the ozone layer through halogen gases or other chemical pathways, though the details remain an area of study. Damage to ozone would allow more ultraviolet radiation to reach the surface, potentially harming plants, plankton, and reproductive cells. Even without that added factor, the list of stressors was already severe. Warming, acidification, low oxygen, toxic waters, acid rain, habitat loss, changing rainfall, and food web collapse. The Permian extinction was not a simple murder mystery with one weapon on the table. It was more like arriving at a crime scene and finding that the house flooded, burned, lost power, and was also full of bees. One can point to the volcanoes as the prime suspect, but the way they caused death involved many instruments. It is worth pausing on the scale again, because the human mind tends to shrink ancient catastrophes into something more manageable. The Siberian traps were not simply big, they were among the largest known volcanic events associated with a mass extinction. The volume of erupted and intruded magma was enormous, measured in millions of cubic kilometers when considering the full province. Even if only a portion erupted at the surface, the underground intrusions were vast. These numbers can become numbingly large, so it may help to think in layers. A single lava flow can bury a landscape. Repeated lava flows can bury a region. A flood basalt province can build a new geological surface across an area larger than many modern nations. And if the eruptions continue in pulses while gases accumulate and feedbacks begin, the atmosphere and oceans become extensions of the lava field. For the creatures living through it, there would have been no single clear beginning. Perhaps some generations knew drier conditions than their ancestors. Perhaps others experienced unusual heat. A forest that had once returned after seasonal stress no longer recovered fully. A shoreline community found fewer young surviving. A river carried more mud. A shallow sea became warmer, then more stagnant. In one place, animals died suddenly from local volcanic poisoning or fire. In another, populations declined slowly through failed reproduction. The disaster would have arrived unevenly, like a tide moving into many cracks at once. Some regions may have remained habitable longer. Some organisms may have migrated if there was anywhere better to go. But as the crisis grew, safe places became fewer, and the background conditions of the planet shifted against them. The sky itself may have told the story in colour and light. Volcanic aerosols can produce vivid sunsets. dust and haze can dim sunlight. Acid rain can leave damage not as a dramatic splash, but as weakened leaves, altered soils, and stressed fresh water. Animals would not understand atmospheric chemistry, but they might have known the practical results. Less shade, fewer edible plants, warmer water, harsher dry seasons, strange-smelling air near certain regions, and landscapes that no longer behaved as expected. Life depends on expectation more than we often realise. Seeds expect seasons. Eggs expect suitable temperatures. Migrating animals expect water or food in familiar places. Reefs expect seawater within certain chemical limits. When those expectations fail repeatedly, survival becomes a gamble with worse odds each year. The volcanic crisis also disrupted the carbon cycle, one of the great slow rhythms of Earth. Normally carbon moves between atmosphere, ocean, living things, rocks and sediments. Volcanoes release carbon dioxide. Weathering of rocks can remove carbon dioxide over long periods. Organic matter can bury carbon. Oceans absorb and release carbon. Life participates through photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and shell building. Over millions of years, this cycle helps regulate climate, but the Siberian traps appear to have injected carbon into the system at a rate and scale that overwhelmed the slow stabilising processes. Rock weathering can draw down carbon dioxide, but it takes time. The extinction crisis did not politely wait for the thermostat to catch up. This imbalance helps explain why recovery was so slow. When the eruptions and their immediate effects passed, Earth did not simply reset. Carbon remained in the system. Oceans had to reoxygenate. Weathering had to work. Ecosystems had to rebuild from survivors. Soil systems needed plants. Reefs needed builders. Food webs needed complexity. In some places, harsh conditions may have returned repeatedly, interrupting recovery. It is one thing for life to survive a blow. It is another to rebuild while the room is still shaking. The long aftermath of the Great Dying suggests that the volcanic disruption pushed Earth into a state that remained unstable for a very long time. And yet, while the Siberian traps were immense, they did not instantly sterilize the planet. This distinction matters. The Earth did not become a ball of lava. Life didn't vanish completely. Microbes endured. Some plants survived. Some animals found ways through. The catastrophe was selective, uneven, and devastating rather than absolute. That is what makes it scientifically fascinating and emotionally unsettling. Complete destruction is simple to imagine, even if terrible. Near destruction is more complicated. It means there were thresholds, refuges, tolerances, lucky accidents, and narrow pathways through disaster. The volcanoes pushed the world toward collapse, but the final outcome depended on how atmosphere, ocean, land, and life responded together. As the eruptions continued and their gases spread through the Earth system, the oceans were being prepared for one of the most lethal transformations in their history. The warming atmosphere pressed heat into surface waters. Circulation patterns weakened in vulnerable regions. Oxygen declined. Carbon dioxide altered acidity. Nutrients washed from damaged land into coastal seas. Microbial communities shifted. The sea floor, once busy with burrowers, filter feeders, reef builders, and shell-forming animals, began to face conditions that many of its inhabitants could not tolerate. The volcanic story therefore does not end at the lava fields. It moves outward, into the air, into rain, into rivers, and finally into the water, where the next part of Earth's near-death experience unfolded quietly beneath the surface, in seas that were beginning to turn against the life they had carried for hundreds of millions of years. By the time the volcanic gases had spread through the atmosphere and the climate had begun to shift, the oceans were already being pulled into the crisis. At first glance, that might seem strange. The sea looks so enormous, so deep, so steady, that it feels almost impossible for anything to truly disturb it. Stand beside a shoreline today, and the water seems ancient in a way that makes human worries look rather small. Waves keep arriving, tides keep breathing in and out. Heap. The horizon sits there with the calm confidence of something that has seen absolutely everything and is not easily impressed. But the ocean is not just a blue surface. It is a chemical system, a climate system, a habitat, a circulation machine, and a breathing space for countless forms of life. Change its temperature, its oxygen, its acidity, or the way its layers mix, and the sea can become dangerous from the inside out. During the Permian crisis, that is exactly what began to happen. The oceans did not simply get warmer. In many places they became harder to breathe in, harder to build shells in, and in the worst regions actively poisonous. It was not the kind of disaster with flames on the horizon. It was quieter than that. The water itself changed character. For the animals living in the late Permian seas, the first problem was heat. As carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere, global temperatures rose and the oceans absorbed much of that extra warmth. This is what oceans do. They take in heat slowly, store it, move it around, and release it over time, which is very useful when the climate is stable and somewhat less useful when the planet is receiving too much warmth for too long. Warm water creates a basic challenge for marine life, because it holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. This is simple chemistry with enormous consequences. A cold sea can carry more oxygen for animals to breathe. A warm sea carries less. So as the Permian oceans warmed, many animals were trying to live in water that offered them less of the thing they needed most. It is a little like being asked to run uphill while someone quietly removes part of the air. You may still manage for a while, but the margin for error shrinks. The second problem was that warm oceans tend to become more layered. In a healthy, well-mixed ocean, surface waters exchange gases with the atmosphere, including oxygen, and currents help carry that oxygen downward into deeper waters. Deep waters also return nutrients upward, feeding plankton and supporting food webs. This movement is not random. It depends on temperature, salinity, winds, currents, and the shape of ocean basins. But when surface waters become very warm, they can sit on top of deeper waters like a lid. Warm water is less dense than cold water, so the layers mix less easily. If the upper ocean stops communicating properly with the deeper ocean, then oxygen has trouble reaching the depths. The deep sea becomes stagnant, and once oxygen is used up by microbes decomposing sinking organic matter, it may not be replaced quickly enough. This leads to anoxia, the absence or near absence of oxygen. For a great many marine animals, anoxic water is not simply unpleasant, it is unlivable. Now, the ocean has always had low oxygen zones. Even today, there are parts of the modern ocean where oxygen is naturally scarce. Some organisms are adapted to those places, and microbes in particular are very good at making a living in chemical neighbourhoods that would send most animals into immediate complaint. But during the Permian crisis, low oxygen conditions appear to have expanded severely. Large regions of the ocean may have become oxygen poor, especially in deeper waters and along some continental shelves. That is important because continental shelves are where much marine life tends to be concentrated. Shallow seas receive sunlight, nutrients, and sediment from land. They support reefs, seafloor communities, plankton, fish, shell builders, and many of the busy ecological interactions that make marine ecosystems rich. If those areas lose oxygen, the damage spreads through food webs quickly. It is not just that a few deep-sea pockets become difficult. It is that the neighbourhoods where life is most active begin to fail. The process can feed itself. When land plants are damaged by heat, drought, acid rain, or fire, soils become more exposed. Rivers carry more sediment and nutrients into the sea. Extra nutrients can fuel blooms of algae and microbes near the surface. At first, that might sound like a good thing. More tiny life at the base of the food chain, perhaps. But when those blooms die, they sink, and microbes break them down, consuming oxygen in the process. If the water is already warm and poorly mixed, that oxygen is not replaced fast enough. So nutrient runoff can help create oxygen-starved waters. We see a small modern version of this in coastal dead zones, where fertilizer runoff feeds blooms that later decay and strip oxygen from the water. The late Permian version was not caused by farm fields, of course. There were no farmers, no tractors, and no one standing beside a river saying, "Well, that seems like a concerning amount of runoff." But damaged landscapes, warming seas, and altered nutrient cycles could still produce a similar kind of oxygen crisis on a much larger and more ancient scale. Once oxygen disappears, a different microbial world becomes more important. Some bacteria can live without oxygen by using other chemical pathways. Among them are sulfate-reducing bacteria, which use sulfate in seawater and produce hydrogen sulfide as a waste product. Hydrogen sulfide is the gas that smells like rotten eggs, although if you're in a situation where the ocean smells strongly of rotten eggs, the smell is probably the least of your concerns. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to many forms of life. In sufficient concentrations, it interferes with cellular respiration, the process by which organisms use oxygen to produce energy. In oxygen-free waters where sulfate-reducing microbes thrive, hydrogen sulfide can accumulate. When water is both anoxic and rich in hydrogen sulfide, scientists call it euxenic. It is one of those words that sounds oddly tidy for something so hostile. Euxenic water is a serious threat because it does not merely lack oxygen, it contains poison. Animals that might tolerate low oxygen for short periods cannot simply adapt to hydrogen sulfide in large amounts. Shellfish, worms, fish, reef organisms, and many other marine creatures would be vulnerable. If these toxic waters stayed deep, they would damage deep habitats. If they spread onto shelves or rose upward during changes in current, storms, or seasonal mixing, they could invade shallower ecosystems. Some researchers have suggested that hydrogen sulfide may even have reached the atmosphere in places if euxenic waters became widespread and shallow enough. That idea remains complex and debated in its details, but the general point is clear. Once the ocean's oxygen structure breaks down, the chemistry can shift into a state that favours microbes and punishes animals. The sea does not need to boil or drain away to become deadly. It only has to lose the chemistry that animals depend on. There is evidence in ancient rocks that parts of the late Permian and earliest Triassic oceans experienced widespread anoxia and euxenia. Scientists study this through chemical clues preserved in sediments. Certain minerals, isotopes, and organic molecules can indicate low oxygen or the presence of sulfide. For example, some biomarkers are associated with green sulfur bacteria, microbes that need light but live in sulfidic, oxygen-free water. If their traces appear in ancient marine rocks, that can suggest hydrogen sulfide reached into sunlit layers of the water column. Imagine that for a moment. Toxic, oxygen-free water, not hidden far below in the deep sea, but close enough to the surface for light-dependent microbes to live there. That is not the normal blue ocean we like to picture. That is an ocean whose internal boundaries have shifted in a very dangerous way. At the same time, carbon dioxide was changing seawater acidity. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which affects the balance of carbonate chemistry. Many marine organisms build shells or skeletons from calcium carbonate. Brachiopods, corals, some sponges, algae, and many tiny planktonic organisms depend on carbonate availability. If seawater becomes more acidic, it can become harder to build and maintain these structures. The ocean does not have to become acid in the way a lemon is acid. Even a relatively small shift in pH can matter, because it changes the chemistry that shell builders use. For an animal already facing heat stress and low oxygen, having to spend more energy on shell maintenance is not a minor inconvenience. It is another cost added to an already overdrawn survival budget. This may help explain why so many marine groups were devastated. Brachiopods, which had long been abundant in Paleozoic seas, suffered severe losses. Reef systems collapsed. Trilobites, those ancient survivors of earlier eras, disappeared completely. Many ammonoids vanished, though some lineages survived and later diversified again. Crinoids, bryozoans, corals, and numerous seafloor animals were hit hard. The extinction did not remove every marine organism equally. Some groups fared better than others, and survivors would later shape the seas of the Triassic and beyond. But the overall scale of marine loss was extraordinary. Around 90% of marine species are estimated to have disappeared. That is not just a bad century. That is the ocean losing much of its living vocabulary. The seafloor would have changed visibly if anyone had been there with a lamp, a notebook, and a very poor sense of self-preservation. In healthy marine sediments, many animals burrow, feed, crawl, and stir the mud. This activity is called bioturbation, and it leaves traces in the rock record: trails, tunnels, churned layers, and disrupted sediments. After the extinction, in many places, those traces become simpler or rarer. Sediments may appear more laminated, meaning thin layers remain undisturbed because fewer animals were there to mix them. It is a quiet sign of ecological collapse. The mud stopped being worked by life. The seafloor, once busy with hidden movement, became still in places. Not everywhere, not forever, but enough to show that the communities living there had been stripped down. The collapse of reefs was especially important. Reefs are centres of marine diversity, but they are also sensitive to environmental stress. They require suitable temperatures, oxygenated water, chemistry that allows skeletons to form, and ecological relationships among many organisms. During the end Permian crisis, reef ecosystems were severely reduced, and the recovery of reef building took a very long time. Without reefs, many species lost shelter and feeding grounds. The physical complexity of shallow marine habitats declined. A reef is like a city built by organisms that do not know they are urban planners. When that city disappears, the loss is not just architectural, it is social, biological, and ecological. The creatures that use the reef as a nursery, hiding place, hunting ground, or attachment surface must either move, adapt, or vanish. In the late Permian oceans, many vanished. Food webs were also disrupted from the bottom upward. Plankton and microbes respond quickly to changing chemistry and temperature. If the base of the food web shifts toward forms that are less nutritious, more toxic, or more likely to create low oxygen conditions when they decay, then larger animals suffer. Filter feeders depend on particles in the water, predators depend on prey, scavengers depend on remains, burrowers depend on oxygenated sediment. When the chemical conditions of the water favour microbial blooms and reduce animal activity, the whole ecosystem can simplify. That simplification is one of the marks of a world under extreme stress. Complex ecosystems have many links, many niches, many backups. Collapse removes options. Life becomes narrower. There may have been a strange advantage for some organisms that tolerated harsh conditions. Bivalves, for instance, became more prominent in some post-extinction settings. Certain small, opportunistic organisms could spread rapidly in disturbed environments. Microbial mats may have expanded in places where grazing and burrowing animals declined. Microbial mats are layered communities of microorganisms that can cover sediment surfaces, and they were much more common earlier in Earth history before animals became widespread enough to disturb them. After mass extinctions, when animal activity is reduced, microbial mats can return in what some scientists call a microbialite resurgence. It is as if the ocean temporarily became more ancient in character, sliding back toward a simpler style of life dominated by microbes and fewer complex animals. Not backward in any purposeful sense, of course. Evolution does not rewind like a video, but ecosystems can lose complexity and leave space for older kinds of ecological structures to reappear. This is one of the unsettling things about the Great Dying. It did not only kill species, it changed the texture of life. The ocean after the crisis was not simply the old ocean with fewer animals, it was a different kind of system, at least for a time. More microbial, less reef-rich, less deeply burrowed, less diverse, and more prone to harsh chemistry. For animals trying to survive through the boundary, the world may have been full of temporary refuges and sudden traps. A patch of shallow water might be tolerable one season and deadly the next. A deeper basin might lose oxygen. A coastal area might receive pulses of sediment and nutrients from damaged land. A warming event might push temperatures beyond what eggs or larvae could survive. Marine life often depends on delicate early life stages, larvae drifting in plankton, tiny shells forming, embryos developing in specific conditions. Adults may endure stress for a while, but if reproduction fails repeatedly, populations disappear quietly. The idea of poisonous oceans can sound exaggerated, almost like a bedtime story told by a particularly gloomy geologist. But the mechanisms are real. Anoxic and euxinic waters exist. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic. Warming reduces oxygen solubility. Stratification limits mixing. Carbon dioxide changes pH. Nutrient loading can worsen oxygen loss. These are not imaginary processes. What made the end Permian crisis so extreme was their scale and combination. The oceans were pushed toward conditions that favoured microbial metabolisms over animal life across large regions. For organisms that had evolved in oxygenated marine habitats, this was a profound environmental betrayal. The sea, which had supported animal life for hundreds of millions of years, became in many places a chemical barrier. There is another detail that makes this worse. Animals under heat stress need more oxygen, not less. Metabolism generally increases with temperature up to a point, meaning many animals require more oxygen to function in warmer conditions, so warming creates a double burden. The water holds less oxygen, while the animal's body may demand more. This mismatch can be lethal even before oxygen reaches zero. Large active animals may be especially vulnerable because they need a steady oxygen supply. Smaller or less active organisms may sometimes tolerate lower oxygen better, but only within limits. The late Permian seas were not just becoming oxygen poor, they were becoming oxygen poor at the same time that heat was increasing demand. That is a cruel bit of chemistry, and chemistry is not known for its sympathy. In shallow tropical seas, temperatures may have exceeded the tolerance of many organisms. Some researchers have suggested that the tropics became so hot that many marine animals were excluded from them for a time, leaving a kind of low diversity zone where life struggled to maintain itself. If true, this would mean the warmest parts of the ocean, often associated with high biodiversity and stable climates, became nearly empty of many animal groups. The idea of tropical seas as biological deserts feels upside down from a modern perspective, where coral reefs and warm waters are often symbols of abundance. But abundance depends on conditions staying within tolerable bounds. Warmth can support diversity until it becomes too much. Then warmth becomes stress. The chemical damage would not have been evenly distributed. Some regions of the ocean would have remained better oxygenated longer than others. High latitude waters may have offered cooler refuges. Areas with stronger mixing may have been safer. Shallow settings exposed to waves and currents could sometimes hold more oxygen, though they were also vulnerable to heat and acidification. Survival often depends on geography. The same species might vanish from one region and persist in another. A small population in a tolerable pocket can become the ancestor of later recovery, while a larger population in a collapsing habitat disappears. This is one reason extinction is both biological and geographical. Where you are matters, sometimes as much as what you are. As marine animals died, their disappearance affected the carbon cycle and seafloor chemistry. Fewer burrowers meant sediments were mixed less. More organic matter could accumulate in low oxygen settings. Microbial decomposition pathways shifted. Sulfur cycling became more prominent in some environments. The ocean's chemistry and biology kept feeding back into one another. A dying ecosystem is not passive. It continues to process matter and energy, but in altered ways. Microbes do not stop because animals are in trouble. In fact, microbial life may flourish in conditions that animals find fatal. From the point of view of bacteria adapted to low oxygen or sulfidic settings, the crisis may have opened opportunities. Mass extinction for animals can be expansion for microbes. The planet does not have one definition of good conditions, it depends who is asking. For shell-forming creatures, acidification would have added another layer of danger. Many marine animals build skeletons from aragonite or calcite, different forms of calcium carbonate. The ease of building those materials depends on saturation state, which is affected by temperature, pressure, alkalinity, and dissolved carbon dioxide. If saturation drops, shells become more costly to form and may dissolve more easily. Young organisms are often especially vulnerable because their shells are tiny and delicate. A species can survive as adults for a while, but if juveniles cannot build shells, the future ends quietly. This kind of extinction does not look like dramatic death. It looks like fewer young, smaller populations, missing generations, and then absence. The late Permian oceans were also affected by changes in sea level and habitat area. As climates shifted and continental configurations influenced shallow seas, marine habitats expanded and contracted in different regions. Sea level changes can expose shelves, alter coastlines, and disrupt communities. On their own, such changes are not always catastrophic. Life has handled rising and falling seas many times, but combined with warming, anoxia, acidification, and toxic chemistry, habitat disruption becomes another stress. A species forced to move by changing sea level may find that the new habitat is too warm or oxygen poor. A reef community damaged by chemistry may not be able to rebuild before the next disturbance arrives. Survival requires not just one tolerable factor, but a workable combination. The fossil record across the boundary shows this simplification with a kind of severe patience. Before the extinction, many marine rocks contain abundant and varied fossils. Afterward, diversity drops sharply. Certain disaster taxa, organisms that thrive in disturbed conditions, may become common. Some early Triassic marine communities are dominated by a small number of hardy forms. The richness returns only slowly, over millions of years. The slow recovery tells us that the crisis did not end neatly when the main extinction pulse passed. Environmental stress persisted. Oceans remained difficult. Ecosystems had to rebuild basic structure. Complex life does not recover simply because death stops increasing. It needs stable conditions, ecological interactions, and enough time for diversity to accumulate again. One way to picture the Permian ocean crisis is to imagine a grand old library where every shelf is connected to every other shelf by ladders, notes, and careful arrangements. Then the lights dim, the air grows thin, some rooms fill with fumes. The catalogue system fails. Many of the librarians vanish. A few people remain, but they can only keep a handful of shelves organised. The building still exists. Some books are still there, but the system that made it rich and useful has broken down. In the same way, the ocean after the extinction still contained life. It was not empty water, but many of the relationships that had made late Permian marine ecosystems diverse and stable were gone. It is important, though, not to imagine the ocean as evil or vengeful. The sea was not attacking life. It was responding to physics and chemistry. Warmth, gases, circulation, nutrients, microbes, and minerals interacted according to ordinary rules, but the result was extraordinary harm. This is often how planetary disasters work. They do not require intention. No part of the Earth system needs to decide anything. A volcano releases carbon. Carbon warms climate. Warmth changes ocean mixing. Low oxygen favours certain microbes. Those microbes produce toxic compounds. Animals die. Each step follows from the previous one, and none of the steps cares whether the outcome is convenient for a brachiopod. For the animals that survived, the challenge was to find tolerable water, tolerable temperatures, and enough food in a world where all three were uncertain. Some survivors may have had broad environmental tolerances, some may have reproduced quickly, some may have lived in areas less affected by anoxia or heat. Some may simply have been lucky. In extinction, luck is not a small factor. A lineage can persist because one population happened to live in a refuge at the right time. Another lineage, equally well adapted under normal conditions, can disappear because its range overlapped too closely with the worst of the crisis. Evolution is not a judge awarding survival to the most deserving. It is more like a very long set of tests, and sometimes the questions change without warning. As the oceans became warmer, more acidic, less oxygenated, and in places toxic, marine ecosystems began to collapse at a scale Earth had rarely seen. But the crisis was not confined beneath the waves. The land was also failing in its own way. Forests were thinning or disappearing in some regions. Rivers were changing, herbivores were losing food. Predators were losing prey. Heat and drought were pressing into bodies that had not evolved for such extremes. The ocean's suffocation and poisoning were part of a wider planetary breakdown, and as the seas lost their balance, the living world moved closer to the moment when extinction stopped being a background process and became the dominant fact of life on Earth. With the oceans losing oxygen and the land beginning to shed its forests, the crisis entered the stage that would later make this event infamous. This was the point where the damage stopped being a set of warning signs and became a biological collapse. The Great Dying had begun. Not with a single thunderclap across the planet, not with every creature looking up at the same darkened sky, and not with one neat moment where life crossed an invisible line and politely fell over. It began unevenly, in different places, through different failures. A reef community stopped replacing itself. A shallow sea became too warm and too low in oxygen. A forest failed to grow back after drought or fire. A herbivore found less food. A predator found fewer herbivores. A population shrank, then vanished, and no one was there to mark the occasion except the mud, which is a patient record keeper but not a very sentimental one. When we talk about mass extinction, it is easy to make it sound like a number first and a living event second. Around 90% of marine species disappeared. A majority of land vertebrate species vanished. Many insect groups suffered severe losses. Trilobites, after surviving for hundreds of millions of years, reached the end of their long history. Reef ecosystems collapsed. Forests were reduced across large regions. These numbers are astonishing, but they also smooth away the texture of what happened. Extinction is counted in species, but experienced in bodies. It is an animal unable to cool itself. A shell-forming creature whose young cannot build properly in changing seawater. A fish entering water with too little oxygen. A plant dropping seeds into soil that no longer supports the same growth. A burrow that remains empty. A shoreline where the usual small movements in the sediment stop. The Great Dying was not one death. It was death repeated through ecosystems until the old world could no longer hold its shape. In the oceans, the first losses would have looked like disruption, then absence. Marine ecosystems are highly connected. Filter feeders depend on suspended food particles and oxygenated water. Shell builders depend on carbonate chemistry. Predators depend on prey. Reef dwellers depend on the structure built by other organisms. Burrowers depend on sediments that are not poisoned or starved of oxygen. When several environmental stresses arrive together, the connections begin to break. The late Permian seas were becoming warmer, more acidic, and more prone to oxygen loss. In some places, toxic hydrogen sulfide may have spread through parts of the water column. For animals living in these environments, there was not one simple problem to solve. Moving into shallower water might avoid deep anoxia but increase heat stress. Moving into deeper water might reduce temperature but risk lower oxygen. Remaining near reefs offered shelter only if reefs were still alive. It is difficult to be adaptable when every direction contains a different version of trouble. Some animals may have died in sudden local events, especially where low oxygen or toxic waters spread rapidly onto shelves. A change in currents, a storm mixing deeper sulfidic water upward, or a seasonal shift could turn a tolerable habitat into a lethal one. Imagine a shallow marine community living on a seafloor that has supported life for generations. Branchiopods, attached or resting in the sediment, worms burrowing, small predators moving between shells, cranoids filtering from the current. Then the oxygen drops. At first, more active animals struggle, burrowers move upward or stop moving, fish leave if they can. Sessile animals cannot leave, because being attached to one spot is a bold lifestyle choice that works beautifully until the neighbourhood becomes poisonous. As oxygen falls further, the community collapses. The dead settle into the sediment. If few scavengers remain, decay follows a different path. The mud records stillness where there had once been movement. This stillness is one of the most haunting parts of the rock record. Before the extinction, many marine sediments are disturbed by animal activity. Creatures burrowed, fed, crawled, and mixed the sea floor. Afterward, in many places, the sediment becomes more finely layered, with fewer traces of animals stirring it. The loss is not just visible in shells, but in behaviour. The animals that once worked the mud were gone or greatly reduced. A busy seafloor had become quiet. That is not a dramatic fossil in the way a skeleton is dramatic, but it may be even more telling. It shows not merely that certain species disappeared, but that the daily functioning of ecosystems had changed. Life had stopped doing some of the ordinary work that made the seafloor alive. The disappearance of trilobites gives the event a particular weight. Trilobites had appeared more than 250 million years before the end Permian crisis. They had lived through earlier mass extinctions, diversified into many forms, and occupied ancient seas for so long that they feel almost like a permanent feature of early animal life. By the late Permian, they were already much reduced from their earlier glory, but they were still there, still carrying that deep history in their segmented bodies and compound eyes. Then they were gone. Not because they were suddenly poorly designed, and not because they had failed at life. They had succeeded for an almost unimaginable span of time. But the Great Dying was severe enough to finish even lineages that had endured previous global crises. Longevity is not protection when the basic chemistry of the world changes around you. Reef ecosystems suffered one of the most devastating blows. Before the crisis, reefs provided structure and shelter for marine communities. During the extinction, many reef-building organisms declined sharply, and the reef systems that had supported complex ecosystems largely collapsed. For millions of years afterward, reefs were rare or greatly simplified. This is a significant clue to the depth of the damage. Reefs require more than individual survival. They require community stability, suitable chemistry, clear enough water, tolerable temperatures, oxygen, and enough time for builders to build. If reefs fail to return, it means the environment remains difficult even after the first wave of extinction has passed. It is like seeing not only that a city has been destroyed, but that no one can rebuild the roads, homes, or markets for a very long time afterward. On land, the collapse had its own character. Forests and plant communities were under pressure from heat, drought, shifting rainfall, acid rain, fire, and soil loss. A forest does not vanish in the same way an animal population does. It thins, fails to regenerate, changes composition, burns, dries, or is stripped by erosion. Spores, pollen, and plant fossils suggest major disruption in vegetation across parts of the world. In some places, what had been stable plant communities gave way to simpler, disturbed landscapes. Fungi may have briefly become more abundant in some records, possibly feeding on dead plant material, though the details are debated. It is not hard to imagine why such a signal would attract attention. A world full of dying wood and stressed forests is a world where decomposers would find plenty to do, rather like being invited to a banquet that no one else is pleased about. When plants declined, the consequences moved outward. Herbivores lost food and cover. Smaller animals lost shade and microhabitats. Soils lost roots. Without roots, landscapes eroded more easily. Rivers carried more sediment, and that sediment entered lakes and seas. The land became less stable, and the oceans received more material that could worsen low oxygen conditions. Again and again, the crisis shows the same pattern. One failure became the next failure's raw material. Dead vegetation helped change soils. Eroded soils changed rivers. Rivers changed coastal seas. Coastal seas lost oxygen. Marine animals died. Their disappearance changed sediments and food webs. The Great Dying was a chain reaction, not in the sense of a quick explosion, but in the slower, broader sense of one system leaning into another until the whole structure began to sag. The animals of the land faced rising heat in bodies built for another world. Large herbivores needed enough vegetation to sustain themselves. Predators needed enough prey. Amphibians needed water and suitable breeding habitats. Small animals needed shelter from temperature extremes and drought. The synapsids, so successful in the late Permian, were hit hard. Many therapsid groups declined or vanished. Gorgonopsians, those powerful saber-toothed predators, disappeared. Many large herbivores also suffered. Their absence would have changed the feel of landscapes, though of course no one was there to feel the emptiness in a human way. Still, ecosystems have a kind of structure made by who eats, who digs, who tramples, who browses, who hides, and who hunts. Remove enough of those roles, and the land becomes unfamiliar even if the rocks remain in place. Some animals may have survived by being small, flexible, or able to use burrows. Burrowing can buffer temperature and moisture, offering a refuge from surface extremes. It can also protect against some predators and environmental stress. But no refuge is perfect. A burrow cannot create food from nothing. It cannot fix the atmosphere. It cannot make plants regrow on a damaged landscape. Yet even a small advantage can matter during catastrophe. The later success of certain survivors, including the famous Lystrosaurus in the early Triassic, suggests that animals with hardy, generalist habits could do well in the emptied world after the extinction. Lystrosaurus was a beaked, tusked, herbivorous synapsid. Not glamorous exactly, but very effective. It became astonishingly widespread after the crisis, which is a reminder that survival does not always look majestic. Sometimes the future belongs to a stout, shovel-faced animal that can cope with bad conditions better than its more elegant neighbours. Insects, too, were deeply affected. This is unusual. Insects are often thought of as resilient, and for good reason. They're numerous, diverse, quick to reproduce, and capable of living in a vast range of habitats. The end Permian event is the only known mass extinction in which insects suffered such a major documented loss. That fact alone tells us something about the severity of the terrestrial crisis. Insects depend heavily on plants, climate, and microhabitats. If forests collapse, plant communities change, soils dry, and seasons become extreme, insect life is disrupted at every level. Herbivorous insects lose host plants, predatory insects lose prey, aquatic insects lose stable freshwater habitats. Pollination as we know it today was not yet dominated by flowering plants, because flowers had not taken over the world, but plant-insect interactions still existed, and many small ecological relationships would have been broken. When even insects are in trouble, the planet is having more than a difficult afternoon. The timing of the extinction has been studied in great detail, but it remains complex. Some evidence suggests that the main marine extinction pulse may have occurred geologically rapidly, perhaps over tens of thousands of years or less in some records, while the broader environmental crisis included longer phases before and after. On human timescales, tens of thousands of years sound slow. On geological timescales, it is alarmingly fast. Evolution can respond to gradual change over long spans, but rapid environmental transformation can outpace adaptation. Species do not adapt because they wish to. Adaptation requires variation, survival, reproduction, and time. If conditions change faster than populations can adjust, extinction follows. Nature is creative, But it is not magic, and it does not keep spare ecosystems in a cupboard. The carbon isotope record shows a major disturbance in the global carbon cycle around the extinction interval. Carbon isotopes are one of the ways scientists track changes in the movement of carbon through atmosphere, ocean, rocks, and life. A sharp shift suggests that enormous amounts of carbon entered the system, or that carbon cycling changed dramatically. This fits with the volcanic story, the release of greenhouse gases, the warming, the ocean acidification, and the collapse of biological productivity in many settings. To a fossil shell or a buried sediment layer, the crisis left chemical fingerprints. These fingerprints are not as visually dramatic as a skeleton, but they are powerful. They show that the extinction was not just a collection of local bad events, it was global. Still, global does not mean identical everywhere. Some places were hit earlier, others later. Some environments were destroyed, others persisted. Some coastlines may have become deadly while others remained livable. Some land regions may have been arid and hot, while others offered temporary refuges. The world was collapsing unevenly, and this unevenness mattered. It created the possibility of survival. If every habitat had become equally hostile at the same time, complex life might have been pushed even closer to total erasure. Instead, patches of tolerable conditions remained. They may have been small, unstable, or temporary, but life does not require comfort to continue. It requires enough. Enough oxygen, enough water, enough food, enough time to reproduce. During the Great Dying, enough became rare. The phrase "Earth almost died" is a metaphor, of course. The planet itself was not dying. Earth is a rocky body with a hot interior, a magnetic field, an atmosphere, oceans, and a long history of being struck, frozen, melted, cracked, and rearranged. The planet would have continued orbiting the sun no matter how many brachiopods objected. Microbial life was also not close to total extinction. Microbes are astonishingly resilient and can thrive in environments that would destroy animals and plants. What nearly died was the complex living world as it had developed. The reefs, forests, food webs, large animals, diverse seafloor communities, and ecological richness that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build. That is still a very serious kind of almost. A house can remain standing after a fire while losing nearly everything that made it a home. For individual organisms, the beginning of the Great Dying would have been confusing only if they had minds capable of framing it that way. Most would simply experience stress. A marine animal opens and closes its feeding structures but finds less oxygen moving across its tissues. A larva fails to develop properly. A plant's reproductive cycle falters after repeated drought. A predator ranges farther and finds less prey. An amphibian returns to a breeding pool that dries too early. A reef builder grows more slowly, then stops. These are small events. But mass extinction is made of small events repeated until they become the defining pattern of the world. There is no need for drama at the level of the individual. The drama appears when the same failure is multiplied across oceans and continents. The loss of large animals on land would have had cascading effects. Large herbivores shape vegetation by feeding, trampling, spreading seeds or spores indirectly through movement, and opening pathways. Predators shape prey behavior and population structure. Burrowers alter soils. When these roles disappear, ecosystems do not merely become less crowded. They function differently. Plants may grow differently where herbivores decline, if the plants can grow at all. Carcasses may be processed differently if scavengers and decomposers shift. Soil structure can change if fewer animals dig or move through it. The whole choreography of the land becomes simpler. It is not silent, but it has fewer instruments. In the seas, some of the surviving communities after the extinction were dominated by opportunistic organisms. This is common after ecological disasters. When specialized species disappear and habitats are disturbed, generalists often move in. These organisms are not lesser. They are often very good at what crisis demands, reproducing quickly, tolerating variable conditions and using available resources without being too picky. But a world dominated by a few opportunists is different from a diverse ecosystem with many specialized roles. It is like replacing an orchestra with a handful of people playing the same tune on whatever instrument survived the flood. There is still music, technically, but the richness has changed. One of the most difficult things to imagine is the duration of suffering in ecological terms. A human disaster usually has a date. A storm makes landfall, a fire begins, a war starts. But the great dying stretched across timescales in which generations of animals were born into worsening conditions, lived their whole lives, and died without seeing a return to normal. For them, the crisis was not an event, it was the world. A species declining over thousands of years might experience many ordinary days within that decline. There would still be sunrise and sunset. Animals would still feed, mate, sleep, fight, flee, and explore. Plants would still sprout where they could. The tragedy is not that life stopped everywhere at once. It is that the conditions supporting diversity kept narrowing, and each generation inherited a poorer set of possibilities. There were probably moments of apparent recovery that failed. After a bad interval, conditions in one region might improve. A few populations might expand. Microhabitats might refill. Then another pulse of warming, acidification, anoxia, or ecological stress could erase the gains. Recovery from a mass extinction is not a straight road. It can be interrupted repeatedly, especially if the underlying environmental disturbance continues. The Siberian traps did not simply erupt once and leave the planet to tidy up afterward. Volcanism likely occurred in phases, and the climate and ocean systems remained unstable. Life was trying to recover while the causes of damage were still unfolding. This is rather like trying to repair a roof during a storm, except the storm is made of carbon dioxide, toxic seawater, and continental-scale ecological collapse, so perhaps not the ideal weekend project. The fossil record after the extinction boundary often shows what scientists call a disaster fauna. Low-diversity communities dominated by a few hardy species. These communities are evidence of survival, but also of how much had been lost. In some marine settings, small bivalves became common. In some terrestrial settings, Lystrosaurus and other survivors spread widely. The world had not ended. That is important. But it had become simplified. The Great Dying was not a clean reset button. It was a bottleneck forcing life through a narrow passage and leaving many lineages behind. The creatures that emerged on the other side carried the future, but they did so in landscapes and seas that were still damaged. As extinction accelerated, the boundary between the Permian and Triassic became not just a line in geological time, but a transformation in the nature of a life on Earth. The Paleozoic era, which had seen the rise of complex marine ecosystems, the greening of the continents, the spread of insects, the evolution of amphibians, reptiles, and synapsids, came to an end. The Mesozoic would eventually bring dinosaurs, pterosaurs, marine reptiles, new kinds of forests, and later birds and mammals, but that later abundance should not make the boundary feel easy. Between those worlds lay a devastated interval, a planet with fewer species, fewer reefs, damaged forests, unstable climates, and oceans that still carried the memory of poison. There is a quiet lesson in how the Great Dying began. It shows that the worst extinctions are not always caused by one obvious blow from outside. The end Cretaceous asteroid left a crater, a global layer of impact debris, and a story that is dramatic enough to fit into a single terrible day. The end Permian crisis is different. It is a story of Earth systems pushing one another beyond limits. Volcanism altering air, air altering climate, climate altering oceans, oceans altering chemistry, land plants failing, erosion increasing, food webs breaking, and survival becoming more difficult in every direction. It was not one door slamming shut. It was many doors closing slowly until only a few remained open. And through those few doors, life continued, but barely in some places. The beginning of the Great Dying was therefore also the beginning of one of the harshest survival filters complex life has ever faced. The question was no longer whether ecosystems would be damaged. They already were. The question became what could endure a planet that was hot, unstable, low in oxygen, chemically hostile and stripped of much of its former richness. The answer would not come from the grandest animals or the most elaborate ecosystems. It would come from the organisms able to persist in the margins, in burrows, in cooler waters, in disturbed habitats, in simplified food webs, in places where the world was still just tolerable enough to allow another generation, while all around them the old Permian Earth continued to disappear. By the time the old Permian world had been broken apart, life was not gone, but in many places it had been reduced to something thin, scattered, and uncertain. The great living systems that had once filled reefs, forests, shallow seas, river plains, and inland basins were now interrupted by absence. This is the strange middle of the story, the part that is neither the world before nor the recovery after, but the narrow, difficult interval when survival itself became the main event. Earth had not become sterile. It had not turned into a lifeless stone drifting quietly around the sun, which would have been a rather severe career change for a planet that had spent so long growing things. But for complex life, the world had become harsh enough that survival depended on small advantages, sheltered places, flexible bodies, and a great deal of luck. The planet was still alive, but it was alive in fragments. Imagine standing on a coastline in the earliest Triassic, just after the worst of the extinction. The air might be warmer than before, perhaps uncomfortably warm depending on where you were. The sea would not necessarily look poisonous from the surface. That is one of the unsettling things about ocean chemistry. A dangerous ocean does not have to look like a boiling cauldron from a storybook. It may still reflect the sky, it may still lap against the shore, it may still move with tides and wind. But beneath that surface, oxygen could be scarce, acidity altered, and deeper waters unstable or toxic. The shoreline might be quiet compared with the world before. Fewer shells, fewer burrows, fewer reef structures, fewer animals filtering, crawling, grazing, and hiding among living surfaces. The sea would still contain life, certainly, but much of the complexity had been stripped away. It was not empty. It was simplified, which can be almost more disturbing, because simplification is what remains when many possible ways of living have vanished. On land, the view might have been equally strange. In some places, plant cover had been damaged or reduced, leaving exposed soils vulnerable to erosion. Rivers may have carried heavy loads of sediment from landscapes where roots no longer held the ground as firmly. Floodplains may have shifted, channels cutting through loose material, spreading mud across lowlands, then drying again under intense heat. Forests where they survived may have been patchier or less stable. The familiar structure of a healthy landscape depends on plants doing their quiet work, holding soil, slowing water, shading ground, feeding fungi and microbes, supporting insects, providing food for herbivores, and making shelter for small animals. When that structure weakens, the land can feel open in the wrong way. Not open like a meadow on a pleasant day, but open like a house after the roof has gone missing, and everyone is pretending the weather will be reasonable. Life at the edge of nothing did not mean life stopped trying. That is one of the remarkable facts of this interval. Even in damaged environments, organisms continue to feed, grow, reproduce, compete, and move into whatever spaces remained. Microbes carried on with impressive indifference to the emotional weight of the situation. Plants persisted where they could. Small animals found shelter. Marine survivors occupied pockets of tolerable water. Some creatures may have become common precisely because so many competitors and predators had disappeared. Disaster opens space, but it opens it brutally. It removes the crowded richness of the old ecosystems and leaves behind bare opportunities for organisms that can tolerate instability. This is not a cheerful opportunity exactly. It is more like being offered a very large empty house after discovering the previous neighbourhood has burned down. The early aftermath of the Great Dying is sometimes described as a survival world, and that phrase is useful because it reminds us that this was not yet a rebuilding world in the full sense. Recovery requires stability. It requires habitats that can persist long enough for complex relationships to form again. It requires food webs with many layers, not just a few hardy organisms making do. It requires reefs that can grow without being repeatedly interrupted, forests that can regenerate, soils that can develop, animals that can spread into niches and specialise. In the immediate aftermath, many of these conditions were missing or unreliable. The planet may have had intervals of improvement, then renewed stress. Heat pulses, low oxygen, ocean acidification, unstable rainfall and ecological emptiness all made recovery slow. Life was present, but it was often living close to its limits. In the oceans, those limits were especially chemical. Animals that had survived the main extinction still had to face warm, oxygen-poor waters. Low oxygen affects behaviour before it causes death. Animals may become sluggish. They may move into shallower areas or higher in the water column, or toward currents where oxygen is better. Burrowing animals may leave the sediment if they can. Sessile animals, attached to surfaces, have fewer options, which is one reason being stuck in place is a bold evolutionary strategy. Under stable conditions, it works beautifully. Under crisis conditions, it becomes a rather serious commitment. If oxygen falls too low, animals cannot produce enough energy to maintain basic functions. If hydrogen sulfide is present, the problem becomes more direct, because the chemistry interferes with cellular respiration. In such waters, survival is not about bravery, it is about physiology. Some marine animals would have had broader tolerances than others. Bivalves, for example, became important in some post-extinction communities. Certain small forms could tolerate disturbed conditions, reproduce quickly, or live in environments where more sensitive animals failed. Opportunistic species may have spread across wide areas. This does not mean they had an easy time. It means that compared with others, they were better suited to the damaged world. In the fossil record, low-diversity communities dominated by a few hardy organisms often appear after mass extinctions. These communities are signs of life's persistence, but also of its reduction. They are the biological equivalent of a skeleton crew keeping a ship afloat after most of the passengers, crew, furniture, and possibly the dining room piano have gone overboard. The seafloor in many places lost much of its usual activity. Burrowing declined. Sediments became less mixed. Microbial mats may have spread across surfaces where animals once grazed or disturbed the mud. This return of microbial mats is important because it suggests that after the extinction, some environments resembled much older states of the Earth, before complex animals had become so effective at stirring sediments and grazing microbial surfaces. It was not a true return to the ancient Precambrian world, of course. Time does not reverse, and the survivors were still descendants of long animal histories. But ecologically, some seafloors became simpler, flatter, more microbial. Where animals had once churned the sediment, thin layers could settle undisturbed. Where grazers had once scraped surfaces, microbial communities could spread. The ocean was still alive, but in some places it was alive in a quieter, older-looking way. On land, survival had a different set of difficulties. Heat and drought would have shaped daily life. Animals needed water, shade, and food, all of which could be unreliable. Plant communities recovering from collapse would have offered fewer stable resources. Herbivores had to eat what was available, and if vegetation was sparse or nutritionally poor, populations would remain low. Predators, already reduced by the extinction, depended on those herbivores and smaller prey. Food chains after a major extinction can become short and fragile. A healthy ecosystem has many pathways for energy to move from plants and microbes into animals and back into soils. A damaged ecosystem has fewer pathways. If one fails, there may be no backup. It is like trying to cross a river on stepping stones after most of the stones have been removed, which is inconvenient even before one remembers the river may be full of Permian runoff. Burrowing may have been one of the key strategies for some survivors. Underground, temperatures are more stable, humidity can be higher, and animals can avoid some of the worst surface conditions. A burrow can protect against heat during the day and cold at night. It can provide shelter from predators and storms. It can help an animal conserve water. In a world of climate extremes, that matters. Some Permian and Triassic animals show evidence of burrowing lifestyles, and it is easy to see why such habits might help during difficult intervals. The surface world may have been too hot, too dry, too exposed, or too unstable. A burrow was not paradise, but it was a refuge. And in a mass extinction aftermath, paradise is far less useful than refuge. Still, burrowing animals were not escaping the crisis completely. They had to come out to feed or find mates. They depended on plants, insects, smaller animals, or other resources that were themselves affected by environmental stress. Their young had to survive. Their populations had to remain large enough to avoid disappearing through bad luck. A refuge buys time, and sometimes time is enough. But it does not solve the whole problem. Many lineages likely had partial protections that helped for a while, but not long enough. Others, perhaps less impressive in appearance, happened to have exactly the right mix of tolerance, behaviour, diet, and geography to continue. Geography mattered enormously. The extinction was global, but global does not mean every square metre was equally lethal. Some regions may have remained cooler. Some waters may have stayed oxygenated. Some river systems may have continued to support pockets of plants and animals. Some uplands may have offered different climates from lowland basins. Some coastal areas may have been better flushed by currents. These refugees did not need to be large to matter. A small surviving population can preserve a lineage. A sheltered valley, a cooler shoreline, a better mixed patch of sea, or a stable freshwater habitat could become the difference between extinction and continuation. From the perspective of future evolution, such places were quiet storehouses of possibility. From the perspective of the animals inside them, they were simply where life was still possible. The trouble is that refuges can be temporary. A place that is safe during one phase of crisis may become unsafe later. A cooler region can warm, a shallow sea can lose oxygen, a river can dry or flood with sediment, a plant community can fail after repeated stress. This means survivors were not just passing through one doorway into safety. They were moving through a shifting maze where conditions changed over generations. Some populations may have expanded during brief improvements, then crashed when conditions worsened again. The early Triassic world seems to have been marked by repeated environmental instability, which helps explain why recovery took so long. Life was not simply waiting for the dust to settle. The dust, so to speak, kept finding new ways to be a problem. For many animals, body size may have mattered. Small animals often have advantages in disturbed environments. They need less food than large animals. They may reproduce more quickly. They can use smaller shelters and microhabitats. They may reach maturity faster, allowing populations to rebound when conditions briefly improve. Large animals, by contrast, require more energy, more space, and often more stable food supplies. During ecological collapse, those needs become liabilities. This does not mean small animals always survive and large animals always die. But after the Great Dying, many of the dominant survivors were relatively hardy forms able to cope with poor conditions. In a damaged world, efficiency can matter more than grandeur. Evolution has never been especially impressed by grandeur when the pantry is empty. There is something humbling about the kinds of organisms that carry life through bottlenecks. They are not always the most spectacular. They are often the overlooked, the small, the flexible, the unfussy. A lineage does not need to be glamorous to become important. It only needs to survive. Some of the animals that would later give rise to major groups in the Mesozoic passed through this harsh interval in reduced form. Early relatives of mammals persisted. Reptile lineages survived. Marine groups that had been devastated held on through a few representatives. These survivors were not yet the architects of a new world. They were more like embers after a forest fire. small points of heat in a landscape of ash. Given enough time and better conditions, embers can become forests again. But during the moment itself, they are just trying not to go out. Plants also had to pass through this bottleneck. Their recovery was crucial because terrestrial ecosystems depend on them. Without plants, soils erode, herbivores decline, insect communities suffer, and carbon cycling changes. Plant spores and pollen from around the extinction interval show major disruption, and some regions may have been dominated by opportunistic plants or weedy forms during recovery. These were plants able to colonize disturbed ground, grow quickly, and tolerate unstable conditions. Again, this is not failure, it is a survival strategy. After a catastrophe, the first plants to return are often not the grand forest builders, but the fast colonizers. They hold the ground, begin rebuilding soils, and create the first steps toward more complex habitats. A weed, in the right context, is not an insult. It is an emergency repair crew. Freshwater ecosystems may have acted as important refuges for some organisms, though they too were affected by climate and erosion. Lakes, ponds, river channels and wetlands can provide shelter and resources, especially in dry landscapes. But freshwater systems are vulnerable to temperature, evaporation, sediment influx and changes in rainfall. Amphibians, fish, invertebrates and plants depending on fresh water would have faced unstable conditions. Some habitats may have vanished seasonally or permanently. Others may have become muddy, warm, or low in oxygen. Yet where water remained, life gathered. A shrinking pond may be dangerous, but it can also concentrate resources for a while. A river corridor may become one of the few routes through a harsh landscape. Survival often clusters around water because water is not just a resource, it is a habitat, a temperature buffer, a chemical medium, and a meeting place. Microbial life, meanwhile, likely flourished in many disturbed environments. Microbes are not merely survivors in the background, they are major players in Earth systems. They decompose organic matter, cycle sulfur, nitrogen, carbon and metals, influence sediment formation, and shape the chemistry of water and soil. In low-oxygen seas, microbial metabolisms that are usually limited to certain zones could expand. On damaged land, microbes and fungi would process dead material and help form new soils where plant recovery was possible. Microbes do not care whether conditions are aesthetically pleasing to large animals. Give them energy sources and suitable chemistry and they get on with it. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, the world may have become in many places more microbial, not because animals vanished entirely, but because the balance shifted toward organisms that could use the new harsh conditions. This shift would have affected the atmosphere and oceans too. If low oxygen conditions spread, the chemical products of microbial life changed. If decomposition increased in some environments, carbon and nutrients moved differently. If plants declined, less carbon was taken up by terrestrial vegetation. If erosion increased, more nutrients entered the sea. These processes are connected. Life at the edge of nothing was not just life waiting passively for better weather. It was life participating in the damage system, sometimes stabilizing it, sometimes amplifying certain changes, always intertwined with the planet's chemistry. Earth after a mass extinction is not a blank slate. It is a disturbed machine still running, with missing parts and strange noises, but running. For animals living through the aftermath, the world may have seemed sparse, not consciously in most cases, of course, but in practical terms. Fewer competitors could mean more space, but fewer ecosystem partners could mean fewer resources. An herbivore might find less competition for plants, but if the plants are poor or scarce, that is not much comfort. A predator might face fewer rival predators, but if prey is rare, the advantage fades quickly. A marine filter feeder might experience fewer neighbours, but if water chemistry is hostile, solitude is not helpful. Empty space is useful only when it is livable. After the Great Dying, much of the world may have been empty because it was difficult, not because it was inviting. This is why recovery was slow, even though open niches were abundant. We often imagine that after a mass extinction, survivors rapidly expand into empty roles. Sometimes they do, but only when the environment allows it. After the end Permian crisis, environmental stress persisted long enough to delay the return of complex ecosystems. Reefs took millions of years to recover in a substantial way. Terrestrial communities remained simplified. Marine diversity rebuilt gradually, interrupted by continuing harsh conditions. The bottleneck was not just biological, it was environmental. Life had room to expand, but the room was still too hot, too poorly ventilated, and in some places faintly poisonous. Not ideal for hosting a flourishing evolutionary gathering. The edge of nothing was therefore not a single place, but a condition. It was the boundary between persistence and disappearance, reached differently by different organisms. For one animal, the edge was heat tolerance. For another, oxygen. For another, food supply. For a plant, it might be rainfall or soil stability. For a reef builder, carbonate chemistry. For a larva, the narrow conditions needed to develop. Every species has limits, and the great dying pushed many beyond them. The survivors were not outside the crisis, they were inside it, living close enough to their limits that small differences mattered. A slightly cooler burrow, a slightly better mixed current, a slightly broader diet, a slightly faster reproductive cycle, a slightly luckier location. Evolutionary history can turn on such small hinges. It is also worth remembering that the creatures living then did not know they were survivors. That label comes from us, looking backward. At the time, there were only organisms living moment to moment, feeding, hiding, resting, breeding. Moving through heat, mud, shallow water, thin vegetation or oxygen-poor seas. A small synapsid in a burrow was not carrying the future of mammal relatives as a noble duty. A bivalve in a disturbed sea was not thinking, I must represent marine resilience. They were simply alive, and being alive was difficult enough. There is something almost tender in that. The future of complex life passed through bodies that had no idea they mattered. In the long view, this narrow interval shaped everything that came later. By removing so many species and simplifying ecosystems, the Great Dying changed evolutionary possibilities. The old Paleozoic world could not simply resume. Too many lineages were gone. Too many structures had collapsed. The survivors would become the starting material for new ecosystems, but only after enduring the worst conditions and passing through the unstable aftermath. Some groups would remain minor, others would expand dramatically. The Triassic world would eventually become a place of new experiments, archosaurs rising, early dinosaurs appearing, marine reptiles spreading into seas, mammal relatives persisting in smaller roles, and plants rebuilding landscapes. But all of that depended on the thin continuity of life through this dangerous interval. So life at the edge of nothing was not a grand recovery yet. It was a pause in the ruins, though not a still one. Microbes spread across sediments. Small animals sheltered and emerged. Hardy marine creatures occupied disturbed waters. Plants colonized damaged ground. Rivers moved sediment through stripped landscapes. The ocean continued to mix unevenly, sometimes offering oxygen, sometimes withholding it. The climate remained unstable. Extinction had done its terrible work, but the living world had not surrendered completely. It had contracted, simplified, and retreated into whatever places still allowed it to continue. And from those places, from burrows, shorelines, microbial mats, sparse plant communities, cooler waters, and narrow refuges, the next part of the story begins to take shape, not with a triumphant return, but with the quiet fact that something was still breathing. In the world that remained after the worst of the extinction, survival belonged less to the grand and more to the persistent. The old ecosystems had been stripped down, and in many places the living landscape must have seemed oddly bare, not empty but reduced. There is an important difference. Empty means nothing is happening. Reduced means that something is still happening, but with fewer players, fewer roles, fewer connections, and far less security. The survivors moved through a planet that still carried heat in its air, stress in its oceans, instability in its seasons, and damage in its soils. They were not stepping into a fresh new world made ready for them. They were living inside the remains of the old one, among broken food webs and habitats that had not yet learned how to hold together again. The silence after the great dying was not the absence of all life. It was the absence of abundance. One of the most famous survivors of this aftermath was Lystrosaurus, a stocky, beaked, tusked animal from the synapsid line, the broad group that includes mammals and their extinct relatives. Lystrosaurus was not large in the way the biggest Permian herbivores had been large, and it was not elegant in the way people tend to imagine successful animals should be. It had a barrel-shaped body, strong limbs, a short tail, and a skull built for cropping tough vegetation. It looked, depending on one's generosity, a bit like a small-tusked pig, a reptile-shaped bulldozer, or an animal that had just been told the climate was still unstable, and decided to keep eating anyway. But in the early Triassic, after so many other land animals had vanished, Lystrosaurus became extraordinarily widespread. Fossils of it are found across several southern continents, which were then still joined together as parts of Pangaea. Its success was so striking that in some fossil beds, it seems to dominate the land vertebrate community almost completely. That dominance tells us two things at once. First, Lystrosaurus was very good at surviving the conditions that followed the extinction. Second, the world it lived in was deeply impoverished. In a healthy, diverse ecosystem, no single medium-sized herbivore usually becomes almost the whole story. There are many herbivores, many carnivores, many small animals, many ecological roles filled by different species. When one kind of animal becomes overwhelmingly common across huge regions, it often means the ecosystem has been simplified. Lystrosaurus did not conquer a rich world so much as spread through a damaged one where many former competitors were gone. Its success was real, but it was success in a landscape where the usual crowd had disappeared. There is something almost lonely about that. Why did Lystrosaurus survive when so many others did not? Scientists have suggested several possible advantages. It may have been able to burrow, or at least use sheltered resting places, which would have helped it avoid heat and dryness. Its body may have tolerated harsh conditions better than some of its relatives. It may have had a flexible diet, feeding on tough, low-quality vegetation during a time when plant communities were stressed. It may have reproduced efficiently or matured relatively quickly. Geography may also have helped. Populations living in the right places at the right time could pass through the extinction bottleneck while others vanished. None of these advantages has to be dramatic on its own. During a mass extinction, even a small edge can decide whether a lineage continues. Survival is often not about being perfectly suited to disaster. It is about being less unsuited than everything around you. Lystrosaurus also shows us that survival after mass extinction can look repetitive. Fossil communities from the earliest Triassic sometimes show low diversity, with the same few forms appearing again and again. This is what can happen when ecosystems are recovering from collapse. The world has space, but not yet stability. A hardy animal can spread widely because there are fewer competitors and predators. But that does not mean the ecosystem is complex. It means the living world has narrowed. Imagine a large dining hall after a storm with most tables broken and only a few people left eating plain bread because the kitchen is still flooded. There is food, there are survivors, but no one would mistake it for a thriving banquet. Other synapsids survived too, and among them were small forms close to the line that would eventually lead to mammals. These early mammal relatives did not dominate the early Triassic, in the way some of their Permian ancestors had dominated earlier landscapes. Many were small, and many would spend the Mesozoic living in the shadow of archosaurs and later, dinosaurs. But their survival mattered enormously. The extinction had devastated synapsid diversity, yet it did not erase the lineage. Somewhere in those difficult landscapes, small therasids and early cynodonts persisted, carrying traits that would later become important in mammals: changes in teeth, jaws, posture, breathing, metabolism, and possibly insulation. They were not mammals yet, and they were not aware that they were preserving a future. They were simply small animals trying to live through hot days, scarce food, predators, and unstable habitats. But through them, a thread continued. Small size may have helped these survivors. A small animal needs less food. It can hide more easily. It can use burrows, cracks, roots, and small patches of shade. It may reproduce faster than a large animal. It can sometimes survive in marginal habitats that would not support bigger bodies. In the early Triassic, when ecosystems were still unstable and plant productivity may have been reduced in many regions, these advantages could matter. A small animal that can eat insects, roots, seeds, fungi, or whatever limited resources are available may survive where a large specialist cannot. It is not glamorous, but evolution has never promised glamour. A lineage that fits into a burrow and eats whatever it can find may outlast one with impressive teeth, dramatic posture, and a very specific dinner preference. The archosaurs, the broader group that would eventually give rise to crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds, also passed through this interval and began to become more important in the Triassic. They were not yet the rulers of the planet, but the extinction had opened ecological space. In the Permian, synapsids had been dominant in many terrestrial ecosystems. After the Great Dying, with many synapsid groups reduced or gone, other reptiles and archosaur-line animals had room to diversify. This is one of the major evolutionary consequences of mass extinction. It does not simply remove species, it changes which groups have the opportunity to expand afterward. The survivors inherit not the world that existed before, but the world that extinction has made. And sometimes that new world favours different bodies, different habits, and different evolutionary experiments. The early archosaur relatives were not yet the giant dinosaurs people often imagine when thinking of the Mesozoic. Many were modest in size. Some walked in sprawling postures, some more upright. Some were predators, others perhaps omnivores or herbivores. Over time, archosaurs would diversify into many forms, but in the immediate aftermath they were part of a slowly reorganizing terrestrial world. Their rise was not instant. The early Triassic was not a clean stage where dinosaurs marched in after the curtain rose. It was a damaged interval with survivors testing the edges of possibility. Dinosaurs themselves would appear later in the Triassic, after additional ecological shifts. But the path toward them began in part with this survival and expansion of archosaur lineages through the silence after the Permian collapse. In the oceans, survival had its own set of winners and near-winners. Bivalves became more important in many post-extinction marine communities. Compared with many brachiopods and reef organisms, some bivalves may have been better able to tolerate disturbed conditions, low oxygen, shifting sediments, or unstable habitats. They could live in or on sediment, filter feed, and in some cases reproduce and spread effectively. This does not mean bivalves escaped the extinction untouched. Many marine groups suffered. But after the collapse, bivalves were among the organisms that helped fill the quiet sea floors. Over the long run, the shift from brachiopod-dominated Paleozoic-style communities toward more bivalve-rich Mesozoic and modern-style communities was one of the major changes in marine history. The Great Dying helped push the oceans from one ecological era into another. Ammonoids, the coiled relatives of squids and octopuses, were hit extremely hard but did not vanish. This is remarkable because ammonoids repeatedly suffered severe losses during mass extinctions and then diversified again. Their shells, often coiled into elegant spirals, are common fossils in many marine rocks, but their survival across crises was not guaranteed. After the end Permian extinction, only a few ammonoid lineages appear to have made it through, but those few became the source for later Triassic diversity. This is the bottleneck pattern again. Many branches cut away, a few remaining twigs growing into a new canopy. From a distance, later ammonoids may make the recovery look almost inevitable. Up close, it depended on a very small number of survivors. Conodonts, eel-like early vertebrate animals known mostly from tiny tooth-like fossils, also survived the extinction, though they too were affected. Their microscopic feeding elements are useful to geologists because they help date rocks and track ancient marine conditions. To most people, this may not sound as emotionally gripping as a large tusked synapsid standing on a dry floodplain, but small fossils often tell some of the most important stories. The survival of tiny organisms, shelled plankton, small invertebrates, microbes, and obscure marine animals matters because ecosystems are built from the bottom and middle as much as from the top. Large animals attract attention, but the living world depends on countless small bodies doing ordinary things in enormous numbers. Microbes may have been among the greatest beneficiaries of the damaged world. In low-oxygen seas, microbial communities that thrive without oxygen could expand. In places where animals no longer grazed or burrowed heavily, microbial mats could spread across sea floors. These mats are layered communities of bacteria and other microorganisms, and they can stabilize sediments, trap particles, and create distinctive textures in rocks. Their expansion after the extinction shows that animal life had retreated from some of its usual roles. The seafloor was not dead, it was being run differently. Where once animals stirred the sediment and grazed surfaces, microbes reclaimed space. It was a reminder that complex animals are not the only way for Earth to be alive. They are one expression of life, and during the early Triassic, that expression had been greatly reduced. The silence of this world would not have been complete. There would still have been wind in dry basins, water moving through channels, insects in surviving vegetation, small animals digging or feeding, waves on shorelines, and microbial life working everywhere without making much of a fuss. But compared with the late Permian world before the collapse, the soundscape of life was likely simpler. Fewer large animals moving across floodplains, fewer dense forests full of insect activity, fewer reef communities busy with feeding and hiding, fewer burrowers stirring seafloor mud. The silence is partly our imagination, of course, because sound does not fossilize easily, but the evidence of reduced diversity and simplified ecosystems suggests a quieter planet, in a real ecological sense, not silent because nothing lived, but silent because so much had stopped. Plants were among the most important survivors, though their recovery was slow and uneven. Without plants, land animals cannot rebuild their ecosystems. Plants create food, shade, soil stability, and habitats. In the aftermath of the extinction, disturbed environments may have favoured hardy, opportunistic plants that could colonize open ground. Some plant groups declined, others persisted, and eventually new plant communities formed. The early Triassic did not immediately return to lush, stable forests everywhere. In many regions, the land may have been patchy, with vegetation recovering in pulses where climate and soils allowed. This mattered for herbivores like Lystrosaurus, and for insects, small vertebrates, fungi, and soil organisms. The recovery of land life had to begin with green things reclaiming damaged ground, one root system at a time. Fungi and decomposers would also have had important roles. After a global ecological crisis, dead plant material, animal remains, and disturbed soils all need to be processed. Decomposition returns nutrients to ecosystems, but it also depends on moisture, temperature, oxygen, and microbial activity. There has been discussion among scientists about a so-called fungal spike around the extinction, possibly reflecting massive plant die-off, though the interpretation is debated. Whether or not that exact signal means what some have proposed, decomposers were certainly part of the aftermath. They do not receive the dramatic attention of predators or large herbivores, but in a damaged world they help decide how nutrients move back into life. The recycler is not glamorous either, but after catastrophe, recycling is survival infrastructure. Freshwater habitats may have sheltered some survivors better than exposed dry landscapes or oxygen-poor seas. Rivers, ponds, lakes, wetlands and floodplains can act as refuges, especially when surrounding areas are harsh. But these habitats were not perfectly safe. They could dry out, overheat, fill with sediment, or suffer low oxygen. Still, where water remained reliable, it could support plants, invertebrates, fish, amphibians, and small terrestrial animals. A river corridor through an otherwise stressed landscape can become a ribbon of life. Animals may gather there, plants may recover there, and sediments may preserve the traces of their presence. In a world where so many ecosystems had been reduced, even a muddy riverbank could be an important refuge. Survivors were not always the ones with the most advanced features, because extinction does not grade on a neat scale from primitive to superior. It's select through circumstance. A beautifully specialized animal can vanish if its food source disappears. A simple generalist can persist if it can use what remains. An animal with a wide geographic range may survive because some part of its range escapes the worst conditions. A species with narrow habitat needs may vanish even if it was very successful before the crisis. This is one of the most important lessons of mass extinction. Success in a stable world can become vulnerability in an unstable one. Specialization is useful when conditions hold. Flexibility is useful when they do not. The Permian extinction changed the value of traits across the biosphere. The survivors also face genetic bottlenecks. When populations shrink dramatically, they lose genetic diversity. That can make future adaptation more difficult, because there is less variation for natural selection to work with. Small populations are also vulnerable to chance events. A bad season, a local drought, a disease, a failed breeding year. Even after surviving the main extinction, lineages could still disappear during the unstable aftermath. Passing through the boundary was not a guarantee of long-term success. Some survivors were temporary, present in the early recovery but gone later. Others became foundations for future ecosystems. The difference depended on continuing environmental change, competition, reproduction, geography, and luck. In marine settings, the return of more active seafloor communities took time. The traces of burrowing and sediment mixing remained limited in many places after the extinction. This suggests that animals capable of deeply disturbing the sediment were rare or absent for a while. A lack of bioturbation changes sediment chemistry. Oxygen penetrates differently. Organic matter is buried differently. Microbial communities develop differently. In other words, the absence of animals changes the physical and chemical environment, and that changed environment can affect which animals can return. Recovery is not simply a matter of species numbers increasing. It also involves restoring the activities that make habitats suitable for more life. Animals create habitats by living in them, and when too many are gone, the habitat itself changes. The same is true on land. Plants create soil. Burrowers aerate ground. Herbivores influence vegetation. Predators influence movement and population structure. Insects decompose, feed, and interact with plants. When these roles are missing or reduced, the land does not function the same way. Early Triassic ecosystems may have been caught in a difficult feedback. Damaged soils made plant recovery harder. Limited plant recovery restricted herbivores. Few herbivores limited predators. Sparse vegetation increased erosion. Erosion affected rivers and coastal seas. Each missing piece made it harder for the next piece to return. The survivors were not just living in empty space. They were living in systems that had lost some of their self-repairing capacity. And still, life held on. That may sound obvious because we are here now, but it should not feel inevitable. The Great Dying removed so much diversity that the future depended on relatively few surviving lineages. If conditions had become slightly worse, or lasted longer, or eliminated key refuges, the recovery of complex life might have taken a very different path. Life as a whole, especially microbial life, would almost certainly have continued. But forests, reefs, large animals, and the long chain of events leading eventually to mammals, birds, and humans could have been altered beyond recognition. The survivors in the silence were not merely leftovers. They were the narrow bridge between one biosphere and the next. Their world would have been shaped by ordinary needs: a Lystrosaurus cropping sparse vegetation, a small cynodont sheltering in a burrow, a bivalve filtering water in a disturbed shallow sea, an ammonoid lineage moving through marine environments after nearly all its relatives were gone, a plant colonizing exposed ground, microbes spreading across sediment, insects using whatever host plants remained. None of these acts was dramatic in itself. Eating, hiding, reproducing, growing, and decomposing are the daily habits of life. But after the greatest extinction in Earth history, those ordinary habits became acts of continuity. They kept the biosphere from thinning further. They allowed ecosystems, however simple, to remain in motion. There is something useful in seeing survival this way. It was not heroic in the human sense. It was not planned. It was not guided by an awareness of future recovery. The survivors did not rebuild because they intended to restore Earth. They survived because their bodies and behaviours allowed them to continue in a damaged environment. Recovery would come later from the accumulation of these continuations. One generation following another. One patch of plants becoming more stable. One animal population spreading into a nearby basin. One marine community gaining a few more species. One seafloor becoming oxygenated enough for burrowers to return. Nature rebuilds not by announcing a new era, but by doing small things repeatedly until the world becomes complicated again. The silence after the Great Dying was therefore not only a sign of loss, it was also the space in which new patterns could begin. With many old groups gone, ecological roles were open. With reefs collapsed, future reef builders would eventually have room to establish new systems. With synapsid dominance reduced, archosaurs had opportunities to expand. With marine communities simplified, bivalves, ammonoids, and other survivors would take on new importance. This does not make the extinction good. Mass extinction is not a creative act in any gentle sense. It is destruction that later evolution works around. But the history of life is shaped by both survival and absence. The missing groups mattered just as much as the surviving ones, because their disappearance changed the possibilities available to the future. For millions of years, Earth would continue to recover unevenly. Some habitats improved before others. Some communities diversified while others remained stressed. The climate and oceans did not instantly return to comfortable stability. But the worst narrowing had been past. There were still plants on land. There were still animals in burrows and basins. There were still marine lineages moving through warm seas. There were still microbes holding chemical cycles together. The living world had been reduced to a quieter form, but it had not been erased. And as conditions slowly shifted, as carbon was drawn down over long time scales, as oceans regained oxygen, as plants rebuilt soils, and as animals began filling empty roles, the silence after the catastrophe became the first rough ground on which a different Earth would start to assemble itself. For a long time after the Great Dying, Earth did not recover so much as remain in a difficult kind of survival. The worst of the extinction had passed, but that did not mean the planet immediately became comfortable again. A mass extinction is not like turning off a bad machine and then opening the windows for a few minutes. The gases released into the atmosphere, the heat stored in the oceans, the damage to soils, the loss of forests, the collapse of reefs, and the thinning of food webs all had consequences that lasted far beyond the main pulse of death. The old Permian world had been broken, and the early Triassic world that followed was not yet a thriving replacement. It was a planet in recovery, but recovery on geological timescales is a slow and uneven thing. It does not rush because there are empty spaces waiting. It does not hurry because a few survivors are feeling lonely. Earth rebuilds through chemistry, erosion, weathering, reproduction, mutation, migration, and time. Quite a lot of time, in fact, which is rather typical of Earth, a planet that has never seemed especially concerned with keeping to a human schedule. The first part of coming back from the brink was not biological in the familiar sense, it was planetary. The climate system had to begin moving away from its most extreme state. The huge volcanic releases of carbon had warmed the world, and that carbon could not simply vanish. It had to be drawn down slowly by natural processes. One of the most important of these is chemical weathering. When carbon dioxide dissolves in rainwater, it forms a weak acid that reacts with rocks on land. Over long periods, this process breaks down silicate minerals and eventually carries dissolved materials into the oceans, where carbon can be locked away in carbonate sediments. This is one of Earth's great long-term climate stabilizers. It is slow, but it is powerful. Volcanoes add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Weathering removes it. The balance between them helps regulate Earth's climate across millions of years. During the aftermath of the Great Dying, that slow-weathering thermostat had an enormous job to do, rather like being asked to tidy a house after someone has filled the living room with lava, smoke, and several million years of poor decisions. Warm temperatures may have accelerated weathering in some regions, because chemical reactions often proceed faster in warm, wet conditions. But there was a complication. Weathering requires exposed rock, water, and functioning landscapes. If plant cover is damaged, erosion can increase, and weathering patterns change. If climates are too dry in the interiors of Pangaea, some regions may not weather efficiently. If rainfall arrives in intense pulses, sediment can be stripped away quickly rather than quietly processed through stable soils. So Earth's recovery depended not only on carbon being removed, but on landscapes becoming organised enough for that removal to continue effectively. Plants mattered here. They were not just scenery returning after the crisis, they were part of the repair system. Roots break rock, stabilise soil, hold moisture, and help drive chemical weathering. Fungi and microbes around roots also assist in these reactions. A recovering forest is therefore not only a habitat, it is a climate tool, a soil machine, and a quiet geological worker wearing leaves. The oceans also needed time to heal. Oxygen had to return to waters that had become stagnant or toxic. Circulation patterns had to strengthen enough to move oxygen into deeper layers. The chemistry of seawater had to become more favourable for shell building and reef building organisms. This did not happen everywhere at once. Some regions probably improved earlier than others. Better mixed waters may have become habitable, while restricted basins remained oxygen poor. Shallow shelves may have supported simple communities before complex reef systems returned. The deep ocean, once pushed toward anoxia, can remain altered for a long time because deep waters exchange slowly with the surface. If you have ever tried to stir a large pot of soup without splashing it everywhere, you will understand on a very small and domestic scale that mixing matters. Now imagine the pot is the ocean, the spoon is global circulation, and the soup occasionally produces toxic hydrogen sulfide. Not ideal, but very educational. Marine recovery began with survivors that could tolerate the damaged conditions. Some bivalves, ammonoids, conodonts, gastropods, small foraminifera, and other organisms persisted and slowly diversified. But early post-extinction communities were often low in diversity and dominated by a few hardy forms. These were not yet the rich, layered ecosystems of a fully recovered ocean. They were the first biological scaffolding. A few species spread widely. A few feeding strategies worked. A few habitats remained usable. From these beginnings, more complex communities gradually formed. The return of burrowing animals to seafloor sediments was especially important. When animals burrow, they mix oxygen into sediment, process organic matter, and create microhabitats. This changes the chemistry of the seafloor and allows more organisms to live there. In the immediate aftermath, reduced burrowing left many sediments quiet and layered. As burrowers returned, the mud became biologically active again. It is a small thing to imagine, an animal pushing through sediment, but repeated across coastlines and seafloors, it becomes one of the ways the ocean comes back to life. Reefs took much longer. A reef is not built by one organism simply deciding to be ambitious. It requires the right chemistry, clear enough water, stable temperatures, enough oxygen, low sediment stress, and a community of organisms able to grow, compete, support one another, and create structure. After the Great Dying, those conditions were not reliable. Reef ecosystems remained greatly reduced for millions of years. Microbial reefs and simpler carbonate structures appeared in some places before more complex animal-built reefs became widespread again. This slow return tells us that the oceans were not just biologically emptied, they were environmentally difficult for a long time. It is one thing for a few hardy animals to survive in disturbed water. It is another for an entire reef system to build upward, generation after generation, without being interrupted by heat, low oxygen, acidification, or sediment. The reef's return was a sign not only of life recovering, but of the planet becoming stable enough to support long-term construction again. On land, recovery also began unevenly. Plants had to recolonize damaged landscapes. Soils had to rebuild. Rivers had to settle into more stable patterns. Animals had to spread into habitats that could support them. In the earliest Triassic, some landscapes may have remained hot, dry and prone to erosion. Vegetation was patchy in many regions, and without continuous plant cover, ecosystems could not support the same abundance of herbivores and predators that had existed before. The dominance of animals like Lystrosaurus in some places shows both resilience and poverty. It was a survivor doing well, yes, but it was also a sign that many other roles were empty. Over time, however, plant communities diversified again, and with them came more opportunities for insects, herbivores, burrowers, predators, and small vertebrates. Soil is one of the least glamorous parts of recovery, but it is essential. Without soil, a landscape is just a surface waiting to be eroded. With soil, it becomes a place where roots can hold, water can linger, microbes can work, and food webs can begin to rebuild. The animals that inherited the Triassic world were not simply the strongest survivors of the Permian. They were the survivors whose traits happened to fit the new conditions, and their descendants began exploring ecological spaces left open by extinction. Synapsids persisted, including the lines that would eventually lead toward mammals, but they no longer dominated land ecosystems in the way many had before. Archosaurs began to rise in importance. This group would later produce crocodile-line animals, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and eventually birds. In the early Triassic, their rise was still in its early stages, but the opportunity was there. The extinction had cleared many large-bodied roles. As ecosystems recovered, new predators and herbivores appeared. Some animals became faster, more upright in posture, more specialized, or better suited to the changing climates and habitats of the Mesozoic. The world after the Great Dying was not empty for long by geological standards, but it was open in a way the Old World had not been. This is one of the strange consequences of mass extinction. It destroys, and then it makes room. That does not make it beneficial. The loss is real and enormous. Entire evolutionary histories ended at the Permian-Triassic boundary. Trilobites never returned. Many reef builders vanished. Many synapsid lineages disappeared. Countless marine invertebrates, insects, plants, and smaller organisms were removed from the future. But because they were gone, the survivors faced a different ecological landscape. Evolution does not plan ahead, but it does fill available space when conditions allow. Over millions of years, the Triassic world became a place of experimentation. Archosaurs diversified, marine reptiles entered the seas, ammonoids recovered and spread. New kinds of reef communities eventually formed. Insects and plants rebuilt their relationships. Small cynodonts continued along the mammal line, developing traits that would matter much later, even if they spent much of the Mesozoic as modest creatures living around the edges of larger reptile-dominated ecosystems. The recovery was interrupted by continued instability. The early Triassic was not a smooth upward climb. There were additional environmental disturbances, episodes of warming, low oxygen and ecological stress. Some groups diversified, then declined. Some communities formed, then were disrupted. This makes the recovery from the Great Dying one of the longest after any major mass extinction. Full ecological recovery may have taken several million years, and in some systems perhaps longer. Biodiversity can begin to rebound before ecosystem complexity fully returns. That is an important distinction. Counting species tells one part of the story. Understanding how ecosystems function tells another. A habitat with a few species can be alive and stable in a simple way, but a complex ecosystem has many interactions, redundancies, specialists, and feedbacks. After the Great Dying, Earth needed to recover both the number of living forms and the relationships among them. Those relationships are what make a biosphere robust. In a mature ecosystem, if one food source declines, another may be available. If one species disappears, another may partly fill its role. If a disturbance strikes, refugees and diversity help life rebound. In a simplified post-extinction world, there are fewer backups. That is why the early recovery was so fragile. A few hardy species can keep life going, but they cannot by themselves recreate the complexity of a reef, a forest, or a rich floodplain. Complexity takes time because it depends on coevolution, competition, predation, symbiosis, habitat construction, and the slow layering of ecological roles. It is not enough for animals to return. They must interact in enough different ways for the system to become resilient. One of the major steps in recovery was the return of more stable carbon cycling. As volcanic activity waned and weathering drew down carbon dioxide, global temperatures eventually moderated. Cooler conditions allowed oceans to hold more oxygen. Improved oxygenation allowed more marine animals to spread and burrow. More marine life helped stabilize sediments and rebuild food webs. On land, plant recovery helped rebuild soils, increased carbon storage, and supported herbivores. More vegetation may have also increased weathering, continuing the drawdown of carbon dioxide. These processes reinforced one another but slowly. The planet did not heal because one switch flipped. It healed because many cycles gradually moved back toward a state that complex life could use. The supercontinent Pangaea continued to shape recovery. Its vast interior remained harsh in many regions, with strong seasonality and aridity. Coastal regions and river systems often provided better habitats. As the Triassic progressed, ecosystems developed under these geographic constraints. The world was still very different from ours. There were no flowering plant forests, no grasslands, no birdsong, no mammals in familiar forms. But life was diversifying again. Each new lineage that spread into a role made the biosphere a little less empty. Each recovering plant community made the land a little more stable. Each burrow in the seafloor helped oxygen enter the mud. Each predator-prey relationship, each decomposer cycle, each reef-building attempt added another thread to the fabric. The seas, once so hostile, gradually became places of renewed opportunity. Ammonoids diversified rapidly from the few lineages that survived. Marine reptiles began to evolve and occupy predator roles in the Triassic oceans. Bivalves became increasingly important in seafloor communities. New reef systems, eventually involving different builders than those that had dominated before, slowly emerged. These changes marked a shift from the old Paleozoic marine world to a more modern-style marine ecology. The extinction boundary had been a filter, and the organisms that passed through it shaped the next era. The ocean did not return to its Permian state. It became something else. Recovery is often not restoration. It is replacement, reorganization, and reinvention using whatever survived. On land, the same was true. The great synapsid-dominated Permian ecosystems did not simply come back. Some synapsids remained important for a while, but archosaurs rose. By the Middle and Late Triassic, the ancestors and early members of several major reptile groups had diversified. Dinosaurs appeared during the Triassic, initially as relatively small members of broader ecosystems, not yet the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Their eventual dominance would depend on later events as well, including another mass extinction at the end of the Triassic. But the road to their rise began in the ecological aftermath of the Great Dying. Without the end-Permian collapse, the history of land vertebrates might have followed a very different path. This is one of the great turning points in life's history, a catastrophe so severe that it changed not only who lived, but what kinds of futures were possible. The mammal line also continued quietly. Small cynodonts survived and evolved through the Triassic, developing features that would later define mammals more clearly. Their bodies became more efficient. Their teeth became more specialized. Their jawbones changed in ways that would eventually contribute to the mammalian middle ear. They may have had higher metabolic rates, more active lifestyles, and possibly hair or whisker-like structures in some lineages. They were not the dominant animals of the age, but they were persistent. While archosaurs expanded into many large-bodied roles, the mammal relatives endured in smaller niches. This is another reminder that evolutionary importance is not always obvious at the time. The creatures carrying the future may be small, nocturnal, and easy to overlook, which is also a useful excuse for anyone who has ever felt insignificant before breakfast. Earth's recovery from the brink was therefore not a return to the old order. The Permian world was gone. The Triassic world was a new arrangement built from survivors, empty niches, changed climates, and slowly improving conditions. Some losses were permanent, some functions returned in new forms. Reefs came back, but with different builders. Land ecosystems became rich again, but with different dominant animals. Marine food webs rebuilt, but with different balances among groups. The biosphere recovered, but it carried the mark of the extinction in its structure. A healed wound is not the same as untouched skin. It is living tissue, repaired and functional, but shaped by what happened. And this is perhaps the most important part of the story. Life is resilient, but resilience is not the same as invulnerability. The Great Dying shows that complex life can be pushed extremely close to collapse by changes in climate, ocean chemistry, oxygen, habitat stability, and food webs. It also shows that recovery, while possible, can take millions of years. From a human perspective, that is so long it almost becomes meaningless. Millions of years is not a recovery plan for civilizations, forests, reefs, or species alive right now. It is deep time doing what deep time does. The planet can heal, but it may heal into a world very different from the one that was lost. Still, there is something steadying in the fact that life did continue. Through toxic seas, failed forests, volcanic skies, heat, hunger, and ecological silence, some organisms survived. Not because the universe promised them a future, and not because Earth was guaranteed to remain kind, but because life had enough variation, enough refugees, and enough stubborn biological persistence to pass through the narrowest part of the crisis. From those survivors came the Triassic recovery, the rise of new ecosystems, the age of reptiles, the persistence of mammal ancestors, and eventually the long chain of events that leads to us sitting here, thinking about all of it in the quiet safety of a modern evening. So when we look back at the moment Earth almost died, we're not only looking at destruction, we are looking at the fragility of complex life and the deep patience of recovery. We are looking at a planet that became hostile, then slowly became livable again. We are looking at oceans that lost their breath and later regained it, forests that failed and later returned, animals that vanished, and others that stepped into the silence. And we are reminded that Earth's comfort is not automatic. It is made by balances, gases in the air, oxygen in the sea, carbon in rocks, roots in soil, microbes in mud, currents in oceans, and living things interacting in countless ordinary ways. And now, after travelling through volcanic provinces, suffocating seas, collapsing ecosystems, and the narrow survival of life itself, we have moved only a little farther along our own evening. Perhaps you are still awake. Perhaps the room has grown quieter. Perhaps the thought of ancient extinction has turned out somehow to be more calming than expected, which says something interesting about the human mind and its ability to relax while discussing poisonous oceans. So let me ask you gently once more, wherever you're listening from tonight, what kind of Earth is outside your window right now? Is it raining? Is it warm? Is there a city humming nearby, or trees moving in the dark, or the soft stillness of late night? The world around us feels ordinary because we meet it every day, but Earth's history tells us that ordinary is a rare and valuable state. A breathable sky, a living ocean, soil held by roots, insects in the grass, birds in the morning, and sleep waiting at the end of the day are all part of a balance that took immense time to build. If this slow journey through Earth's most dangerous ancient crisis brought you a little calm or a little wonder, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed so more quiet travellers can find this place where science takes its time and the planet tells its older stories. The Great Dying nearly ended the world of complex life, but it did not end the story. Life narrowed, endured, and began again, not quickly, not neatly, but enough. And sometimes enough is the most important word in the history of a living planet. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are on this recovered Earth tonight,